Section 51 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 22. It was while he was mooning along in this mood, working, dreaming, wishing, that there came one day to her mother's house at Riverwood, Carlotta Wilson, Mrs. Norman Wilson, in the world in which she moved, a tall brunette of 32, handsome after the English fashion, shapely, graceful, with a knowledge of the world which was not only compounded of natural intelligence and a sense of humor, but experiences, fortunate and unfortunate, which had shown her both the showy and the seamy sides of life. To begin with, she was a wife of a gambler, a professional gambler of that peculiar order which essays the role of a gentleman, looks the part, and fleeces unmercifully the unwary partakers of their companionship. Carlotta Hibberdell, living with her mother at the time in Springfield, Massachusetts, had met him at a local series of races which she was attending with her father and mother, where Wilson happened to be accidentally upon another mission. Her father, a real estate dealer, and fairly successful at one time, was very much interested in racing horses, and owned several of worthy records, though of no great fame. Norman Wilson had posed as a real estate speculator himself, and had handled several fairly successful deals in land, but his principal skill and reliance was in gambling. He was familiar with all the gambling opportunities of the city. He knew a large circle of those who liked to gamble, men and women in New York and elsewhere, and his luck or skill at times was phenomenal. At other times it was very bad. There were periods when he could afford to live in the most expensive apartment houses, dine at the best restaurants, visit the most expensive country pleasure resorts, and otherwise disport himself in the companionship of friends. At other times, because of bad luck, he could not afford any of these things, and though he held to his estate grimly, had to borrow money to do it. He was somewhat of a fatalist in his interpretation of affairs, and would hang on with the faith that his luck would turn. It did turn invariably, of course, for when difficulties began to swarm thick and fast, he would think vigorously and would usually evolve some idea which served to help him out. His plan was always to spin a web like a spider and await the blundering flight of some unwary fly. At the time she married him, Carlotta Hibberdell did not know of the peculiar tendencies and subtle obsessions of her ardent lover. Like all men of his type, he was suave, persuasive, passionate, eager. There was a certain cat-like magnetism about him also which fascinated her. She could not understand him at that time, and she never did afterwards. The license which he subsequently manifested, not only with her but with others, astonished and disgusted her. She found him selfish, domineering, outside his own particular field, shallow, not at all artistic, emotional, or poetic. He was inclined to insist on the last touch of material refinement in surroundings, so far as he understood them, when he had money, but she found to her regret that he did not understand them. In his manner with her and everyone else he was top-lofty, superior, condescending. His stilted language at times enraged and at other times amused her, and when her original passion passed, she began to see through his pretense to his motives and actions. She became indifferent and then weary. She was too big a woman mentally to quarrel with him much. She was too indifferent to life in its totality to really care. Her one passion was for an ideal lover of some type, and having been thoroughly mistaken in him, she looked abroad, wondering whether there were any ideal men. Various individuals came to their apartments. There were gamblers, blasé society men, mining experts, speculators, sometimes with, sometimes without a wife. From these and from her husband and her own observation, she learned of all sorts of scoundrels, mésalliances, queer manifestations of incompatibility of temper, queer freaks of sex desire. Because she was good-looking, graceful, easy in her manners, there were no end of proposals, overture hints, and luring innuendos cast in her direction. She had been long accustomed to them, Because her husband deserted her openly for other women and confessed it in a blasé way, she saw no valid reason for keeping herself from other men. She chose her lovers guardedly and with subtle taste, beginning after mature deliberation with one who pleased her greatly. She was seeking refinement, emotion, understanding, coupled with some ability, and they were not so easy to find. The long record of her liaisons is not for this story, but their impress upon her character was important. She was indifferent in her manner at most times and to most people. A good jest or story drew from her a hearty laugh. She was not interested in books, except those of very exceptionable character, the realistic school, and these she thought ought not to be permitted except to private subscribers. Nevertheless, she cared for no others. Art was fascinating, really great art. She loved the pictures of Rembrandt, Frans Hals, Correggio, Titian, and with less discrimination and more from a sensual point of view the nudes of Cabanel, Bourigot, and Gérôme. To her there was reality in the works of these men, lightened by great imagination. Mostly people interested her, the vagaries of their minds, the idiosyncrasies of their characters, their lies, their subterfuges, their pretenses, their fears. She knew that she was a dangerous woman and went softly like a cat, wearing a half smile not unlike that seen on the lips of Mona Lisa. But she did not worry about herself. She had too much courage. At the same time she was tolerant, generous to a fault, charitable. When someone suggested that she overdid the tolerance, she replied, "Why shouldn't I? I live in such a magnificent glass house." The reason for her visit home on this occasion was that her husband had practically deserted her for the time being. He was in Chicago for some reason, principally because the atmosphere in New York was getting too hot for him, as she suspected. Because she hated Chicago and was weary of his company, she refused to go with him. He was furious, for he suspected her of liaisons, but he could not help himself. She was indifferent. Besides, she had other resources than those he represented or could get them. A certain wealthy Jew had been importuning her for years to get a divorce in order that he might marry her. His car and his resources were at her command, but she condescended only the vaguest courtesies. It was within the ordinary possibilities of the day for him to call her up and ask if he could not come with his car. He had 3. She waved most of these aside indifferently. "What's the use?" was her pet inquiry. Her husband was not without his car at times. She had means to drive when she pleased, dressed as she liked, and was invited to many interesting outings. Her mother knew well of her peculiar attitude, her marital troubles, her quarrels, and her tendency to flirt. She did her best to keep her in check, for she wanted to retain for her the privilege of obtaining a divorce and marrying again, the next time successfully. Norman Wilson, however, would not readily give her a legal separation, even though the preponderance of evidence was against him, and, if she compromised herself, there would be no hope. She half suspected that her daughter might already have compromised herself, but she could not be sure. Carlotta was too subtle. Norman made open charges in their family quarrels, but they were based largely on jealousy. He did not know for sure. Carlotta Wilson had heard of Eugene. She did not know of him by reputation, but her mother's guarded remarks in regard to him and his presence, the fact that he was an artist, that he was sick and working as a laborer for his health, aroused her interest. She had intended to spend the period of her husband's absence at Narragansett with some friends, but before doing so she decided to come home for a few days, just to see for herself. Instinctively her mother suspected curiosity on her part in regard to Eugene. She threw out the remark that he might not stay long, in the hope that her daughter might lose interest. His wife was coming back. Carlotta discerned this opposition, this desire to keep her away. She decided that she would come. "I don't know that I want to go to Narragansett just now," she told her mother. "I'm tired. Norman has just worn my nerves to a frazzle. I think I'll come up home for a week or so." "All right," said her mother, "but do be careful how you act now. This Mr. Witla appears to be a very nice man, and he's happily married. Don't you go casting any looks in his direction. If you do, I won't let him stay here at all." "Oh, how you talk," replied Carlotta irritably. "Do give me a little credit for something. I'm not going up there to see him. I'm tired, I tell you. If you don't want me to come, I won't." "It isn't that I do want you, but you know how you are. How do you ever expect to get free if you don't conduct yourself circumspectly? You know that you—" "Oh, for heaven's sake, I hope you're not going to start that old argument again," exclaimed Carlotta defensively. "What's the use beginning on that? We've been all over it 1,000 times. I can't go anywhere or do anything but what you want to fuss. Now, I'm not coming up there to do anything but rest. Why will you always start in to spoil everything?" "Well, now, you know well enough, Carlotta," reiterated her mother. "Oh, chuck it. I'll not come. To hell with the house. I'll go to Narragansett. You make me tired." Her mother looked at her tall daughter, graceful, handsome, her black hair parted in rich folds, irritated and yet pleased with her force and ability. If she would only be prudent and careful, what a figure she might yet become! Her complexion was like old rose-tinted ivory, her lips the color of dark raspberries, her eyes bluish gray, wide set, large, sympathetic, kindly. What a pity she had not married some big worthy man to begin with. To be tied up to this gambler, even though they did live in Central Park West and had a comparatively sumptuous apartment, was a wretched thing. Still it was better than poverty or scandal, though if she did not take care of herself both might ensue. She wanted her to come to Riverwood, for she liked her company, but she wanted her to behave herself. Perhaps Eugene would save the day. He was certainly restrained enough in his manner and remarks. She went back to Riverwood, and Carlotta, the quarrel smoothed over, followed her. Eugene did not see her during the day she arrived, for he was at work, and she did not see him as he came in at night. He had on his old peaked hat and carried his handsome leather lunch box jauntily in one hand. He went to his room, bathed, dressed, and then out on the porch to await the call of the dinner gong. Mrs. Hibberdell was in her room on the second floor, and Cousin Dave, as Carlotta called Simpson, was in the back yard. It was a lovely twilight. He was in the midst of deep thoughts about the beauty of the scene, his own loneliness, the characters at the shop work, Angela, and what not, when the screen door opened and she stepped out. She had on a short sleeved house dress of spotted blue silk with yellow lace set about the neck and the ends of the sleeves. Her shapely figure, beautifully proportioned to her height, was set in a smooth, close-fitting corset. Her hair, laid in great braids at the back, was caught in a brown spangled net. She carried herself with thoughtfulness and simplicity, seeming naturally indifferent. Eugene rose. "I'm in your way, I think. Won't you have this chair?" "No, thanks. The one in the corner will do. But I might as well introduce myself, since there isn't anyone here to do it. I'm Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Hibberdell's daughter. You're Mr. Witla?" "Yes, I answered to that," said Eugene, smiling. He was not very much impressed at first. She seemed nice, and he fancied intelligent, a little older than he would have preferred any woman to be who was to interest him. She sat down and looked at the water. He took his chair and held his peace. He was not even interested to talk to her. She was nice to look at, however. Her presence lightened the scene for him. "I always like to come up here," she volunteered finally. "It's so warm in the city these days. I don't think many people know of this place. It's out of the beaten track." "I enjoy it," said Eugene. "It's such a rest for me. I don't know what I would have done if your mother hadn't taken me in. It's rather hard to find any place doing what I am." "You've taken a pretty strenuous way to get health, I should say," she observed. "Day labor sounds rough to me. Do you mind it?" "Not at all. I like it. The work is interesting and not so very hard. It's all so new to me. That's what makes it easy. I like the idea of being a day laborer and associating with laborers. It's only because I'm run down in health that I worry. I don't like to be sick." "It is bad," she replied, "but this will probably put you on your feet. I think we're always inclined to look on our present troubles as the worst. I know I am." "Thanks for the consolation," he said. She did not look at him, and he rocked to and fro silently. Finally the dinner gong struck. Mrs. Hibberdell came downstairs, and they went in. The conversation at dinner turned on his work for a few moments, and he described accurately the personalities of John and Bill, and Big John the engineer, and little Sudsy and Harry Fornes the blacksmith. Carlotta listened attentively, without appearing to, for everything about Eugene seemed singular and exceptional to her. She liked his tall, spare body, his lean hands, his dark hair and eyes. She liked the idea of his dressing as a laboring man in the morning, working all day in the shop, and yet appearing so neat and trim at dinner. He was easy in his manner, apparently lethargic in his movements, and yet she could feel a certain swift force that filled the room. It was richer for his presence. She understood at a glance that he was an artist, in all probability a good one. He said nothing of that, avoided carefully all references to his art, and listened attentively. She felt as though he were studying her and everyone else, and it made her gayer. At the same time she had a strong leaning toward him. What an ideal man to be associated with, was one of her repeated thoughts. Although she was about the house for 10 days, and he met her after the third morning, not only at dinner, which was natural enough, but at breakfast, which surprised him a little, he paid not so very much attention to her. She was nice, very, but Eugene was thinking of another type. He thought she was uncommonly pleasant and considerate, and he admired her style of dressing and her beauty, studying her with interest, wondering what sort of life she led. From the various bits of conversation he overheard, not only at the table but at other times, he judged she was fairly well-to-do. There was an apartment in Central Park West, card parties, automobile parties, theater parties, and a general sense of people, acquaintances anyhow, who were making money. He heard her tell of a mining engineer, Dr. Rowland, of a successful coal mining speculator, Gerald Woods, of a Mrs. Hale, who was heavily interested in copper mines and apparently very wealthy. "It's a pity Norman couldn't connect with something like that and make some real money," he heard her say to her mother one evening. He understood that Norman was her husband, and that he probably would be back soon, so he kept his distance, interested and curious, but hardly more. Mrs. Wilson was not so easily baffled, however. A car appeared one evening at the door immediately after dinner, a great red touring car, and Mrs. Wilson announced easily, "We're going for a little spin after dinner, Mr. Witla. Don't you want to come along?" Eugene had never ridden in an automobile at that time. "I'd be very pleased," he said, for the thought of a lonely evening in an empty house had sprung up when he saw it appear. There was a chauffeur in charge, a gallant figure in brown straw cap and tan duster, but Mrs. Wilson maneuvered for place. "You sit with the driver, Cuz," she said to Simpson, and when her mother stepped in, she followed after, leaving Eugene the place to the right of her. "There must be a coat and cap in the locker," she said to the chauffeur. "Let Mr. Witla have it." The latter extracted a spare linen coat and straw cap, which Eugene put on. "I like automobiling, don't you?" she said to Eugene good-naturedly. "It's so refreshing. If there's any rest from care on this earth, it's in traveling fast." "I've never ridden before," replied Eugene simply. Something about the way he said it touched her. She felt sorry for him because he appeared lonely and gloomy. His indifference to her piqued her curiosity and irritated her pride. Why shouldn't he take an interest in her? As they sped under leafy lanes, up hill and down dale, she made out his face in the starlight. It was pale, reflective, indifferent. "These deep thinkers," she chided him. "It's terrible to be a philosopher." Eugene smiled. When they reached home he went to his room, as did all the others to theirs. He stepped out into the hall a few minutes later to go to the library for a book, and found that her door, which he had to pass, was wide open. She was sitting back in a Morris chair, her feet upon another chair, her skirts slightly drawn up, revealing a trim foot and ankle. She did not stir, but looked up and smiled winningly. "Aren't you tired enough to sleep?" he asked. "Not quite yet," she smiled. He went downstairs, turning on a light in the library, stood looking at a row of books, reading the titles. He heard a step, and there she was looking at the books also. "Don't you want a bottle of beer?" she asked. "I think there is some in the ice box. I forgot that you might be thirsty." "I really don't care," he said. "I'm not much for drinks of any kind." "That's not very sociable," she laughed. "Let us have the beer, then," he said. She threw herself back languidly in one of the big dining room chairs when she had brought the drinks and some Swiss cheese and crackers, and said, "I think you'll find some cigarettes on the table in the corner, if you like." He struck her a match, and she puffed her cigarette comfortably. "I suppose you find it lonely up here, away from all your friends and companions," she volunteered. "Oh, I've been sick so long, I scarcely know whether I have any." He described some of his imaginary ailments and experiences, and she listened to him attentively. When the beer was gone, she asked him if he would have more, but he said no. After a time, because he stirred wearily, she got up. "Your mother will think we're running some sort of a midnight game down here," he volunteered. "Mother can't hear," she said. "Her room is on the third floor, and besides, she doesn't hear very well. Dave don't mind. He knows me well enough by now to know that I do as I please." She stood closer to Eugene, but still he did not see. When he moved away, she put out the lights and followed him to the stairs. "He's either the most bashful or the most indifferent of men," she thought, but she said softly, "Good night. Pleasant dreams to you," and went her way. Eugene thought of her now as a good fellow, a little gay for a married woman, but probably circumspect withal. She was simply being nice to him. All this was simply because as yet he was not very much interested. There were other incidents. One morning he passed her door. Her mother had already gone down to breakfast, and there was the spectacle of a smooth, shapely arm and shoulder quite bare to his gaze as she lay on her pillow apparently unconscious that her door was open. It thrilled him as something sensuously beautiful, for it was a perfect arm. Another time he saw her of an evening just before dinner buttoning her shoes. Her dress was pulled three-quarters of the way to her knees, and her shoulders and arms were bare, for she was still in her corset and short skirts. She seemed not to know that he was near. One night after dinner he started to whistle something, and she went to the piano to keep him company. Another time he hummed on the porch, and she started the same song, singing with him. He drew his chair near the window, where there was a couch after her mother had retired for the night, and she came and threw herself on it. "You don't mind if I lie here?" she said. "I'm tired tonight." "Not at all. I'm glad of your company. I'm lonely." She lay and stared at him, smiling. He hummed and she sang. "Let me see your palm," she said. "I want to learn something." He held it out. She fingered it temptingly. Even this did not wake him. She left for 5 days because of some necessity in connection with her engagements, and when she returned he was glad to see her. He had been lonesome, and he knew now that she made the house gayer. He greeted her genially. "I'm glad to see you back," he said. "Are you really?" she replied. "I don't believe it." "Why not?" he asked. "Oh, signs, omens, and portents. You don't like women very well, I fancy." "Don't I?" "No, I think not," she replied. She was charming in a soft grayish green satin. He noticed that her neck was beautiful and that her hair looped itself gracefully upon the back of it. Her nose was straight and fine, sensitive because of its thin partitioning walls. He followed her into the library, and they went out on the porch. Presently he returned. It was 10 o'clock, and she came also. Davis had gone to his room, Mrs. Hibberdell to hers. "I think I'll read," he said aimlessly. "Why anything like that?" she jested. "Never read when you can do anything else." "What else can I do?" "Oh, lots of things. Play cards, tell fortunes, read palms, drink beer." She looked at him willfully. He went to his favorite chair near the window side by side with the window seat couch. She came and threw herself on it. "Be gallant and fix my pillows for me, will you?" she asked. "Of course I will," he said. He took a pillow and raised her head, for she did not deign to move. "Is that enough?" he inquired. "One more." He put his hand under the first pillow and lifted it up. She took hold of his free hand to raise herself. When she had it, she held it and laughed a curious, excited laugh. It came over him all at once, the full meaning of all the things he had been doing. He dropped the pillow he was holding and looked at her steadfastly. She relaxed her hold and leaned back, languorous, smiling. He took her left hand, then her right, and sat down beside her. In a moment he slipped one arm under her waist, and bending over, put his lips to hers. She twined her arms about his neck tightly and hugged him close. Then, looking in his eyes, she heaved a great sigh. "You love me, don't you?" he asked. "I thought you never would," she sighed, and clasped him to her again. End of Section 51. Section 52 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 23. The form of Carlotta Wilson was perfect. Her passion eager, her subtlety a match for almost any situation. She had deliberately set out to win Eugene because he was attractive to her, and because by his early indifference he had piqued her vanity and self-love. She liked him, though, liked every one of his characteristics, and was as proud of her triumph as a child with a new toy. When he had finally slipped his arm under her waist, she had thrilled, with a burning, vibrating thrill throughout her frame, and when she came to him, it was with the eagerness of one wild for his caresses. She threw herself on him, kissed him sensuously scores of times, whispered her desire and her affection. Eugene thought, now that he saw her through the medium of an awakened passion, that he had never seen anything more lovely. For the time being he forgot Frieda, Angela, his loneliness, the fact that he was working in supposed prudent self-restraint to effect his recovery, and gave himself up to the full enjoyment of this situation. Carlotta was tireless in her attentions. Once she saw that he really cared, or imagined he did. She dwelt in the atmosphere of her passion and affection. There was not a moment that she was not with or thinking of Eugene when either was possible. She lay in wait for him at every turn, gave him every opportunity which her skill could command. She knew the movements of her mother and cousin to the least fraction, could tell exactly where they were, how long they were likely to remain, how long it would take them to reach a certain door or spot where they were standing. Her step was noiseless, her motions and glances significant and interpretive. For a month or thereabouts she guided Eugene through the most perilous situations, keeping her arms about him to the last possible moment, kissing him silently and swiftly at the most unexpected times and in the most unexpected surroundings. Her weary languor, her seeming indifference disappeared, and she was very much alive, except in the presence of others. There her old manner remained, intensified even, for she was determined to throw a veil of darkness over her mother and her cousin's eyes. She succeeded admirably for the time being, for she lied to her mother out of the whole cloth, pretending that Eugene was nice but a little slow, so far as the ways of the world were concerned. "He may be a good artist," she volunteered, "but he isn't very much of a ladies' man. He hasn't the first trace of gallantry." Mrs. Hibberdell was glad. At least there would be no disturbance here. She feared Carlotta, feared Eugene, but she saw no reason for complaint. In her presence all was seemingly formal and at times almost distant. She did not like to say to her daughter that she should not come to her own home now that Eugene was here, and she did not like to tell him to leave. Carlotta said she liked him fairly well, but that was nothing. Any married woman might do that. Yet under her very eyes was going forward the most disconcerting license. She would have been astounded if she had known the manner in which the bath, Carlotta's chamber and Eugene's room were being used. The hour never struck when they were beyond surveillance but what they were together. Eugene grew very indifferent in the matter of his work. From getting to the point where he was enjoying it because he looked upon it as a form of exercise which was benefiting him, and feeling that he might not have to work indefinitely if he kept up physical rehabilitation at this pace, he grew languid about it and moody over the time he had to give to it. Carlotta had the privilege of a certain automobile, and besides, she could afford to hire one of her own. She began by suggesting that he meet her at certain places and times for a little spin, and this took him away from his work a good portion of the time. "You don't have to work every day, do you?" she asked him one Sunday afternoon when they were alone. Simpson and Mrs. Hibberdell had gone out for a walk, and they were in her room on the second floor. Her mother's was on the third. "I don't have to," he said, "if I don't mind losing the money they pay. It's 15 cents an hour, and I need that. I'm not working at my regular profession, you must remember." "Oh, chuck that," she said. "What's 15 cents an hour? I'll give you 10 times that to come and be with me." "No, you won't," he said. "You won't give me anything. We won't go anywhere on that basis." "Oh, Eugene, how you talk. Why won't you?" she asked. "I have lots of it, at least lots more than you have just now, and it might as well be spent this way as some other. It won't be spent right anyhow. That is, not for any exceptional purpose." "Why shouldn't you have some of it? You can pay it back to me." "I won't do it," said Eugene. "We won't go anywhere on that basis. I'd rather go and work. It's all right, though. I can sell a picture, maybe. I expect to hear any day of something being sold. What is it you want to do?" "I want you to come automobiling with me tomorrow. Ma's going over to her sister Ella's in Brooklyn. Has that shop of yours a phone?" "Sure it has, but I don't think you'd better call me up there, though." "Once won't hurt." "Well, perhaps not, but we'd better not begin that, or at least not make a practice of it. These people are very strict. They have to be." "I know," said Carlotta. "I won't. I was just thinking. I'll let you know. You know that river road that runs on the top of the hill over there?" "Yes." "You'll be walking along there tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and I'll pick you up. You can come this once, can't you?" "Sure," said Eugene. "I can come. I was just joking. I can get some money." He still had his $100 which he had not used when he first started looking for work. He had been clinging to it grimly, but now in this lightened atmosphere he thought he might spend some of it. He was going to get well. Everything was pointing that way. His luck was with him. "Well, I'll get the car. You don't mind riding in that, do you?" "No," he said. "I'll wear a good suit to the shop and change over there." She laughed gaily, for his scruples and simplicity amused her. "You're a prince, my Prince Charming," she said, and she flung herself in his lap. "Oh, you angel man, heaven born. I've been waiting for you. I don't know how long. Wise man. Prince Charming, I love you. I love you. I think you're the nicest thing that ever was." Eugene caressed her gently. "And you're my wise girl. But we are no good, neither you nor I. You're a wastrel and a stray. And I hesitate to think what I am." "What is a wastrel?" she asked. "That's a new one on me. I don't remember." "Something or someone that can be thrown away as useless. A stray is a pigeon that won't stay with the flock." "That's me," said Carlotta, holding out her firm, smooth arms before her and grinning mischievously. "I won't stay with any flock. Nix for the flocks. I'd rather be off with my wise man. He is nice enough for me. He's better nor 9 or 10 flocks." She was using corrupt English for the joy of it. "Just me and you, Prince Charming, and I your lovely wastrel. Do you like strays? Say you do. Listen, do you like strays?" Eugene had been turning his head away, saying scandalous, terrible, you're the worst ever, but she stopped his mouth with her lips. "Do you?" "This wastrel, yes. This stray," he replied, smoothing her cheek. "Ah, you're lovely, Carlotta. You're beautiful. What a wonderful woman you are." She gave herself to him completely. "Whatever I am, I'm yours, wise man," she went on. "You can have anything you want of me, do anything you please with me. You're like an opiate to me, Eugene, sweet." You stop my mouth and close my eyes and seal my ears. You make me forget everything I suppose I might think now and then, but I don't want to. I don't want to, and I don't care. I wish you were single. I wish I were free. I wish we had an island somewhere together. Oh, hell! Life is a wearisome tangle, isn't it? Take the cash and let the credit go." By this time Carlotta had heard enough of Eugene's life to understand what his present condition was. She knew he was sick, though not exactly why. She thought it was due to overwork. She knew he was out of funds except for certain pictures he had on sale, but that he would regain his art ability and reestablish himself she did not doubt. She knew something of Angela and thought it was all right that she should be away from him, but now she wished the separation might be permanent. She went into the city and asking about at various art stores, learned something of Eugene's art history and his great promise. It made him all the more fascinating in her eyes. One of his pictures on exhibition at Potteries was bought by her after a little while, and the money sent to Eugene, for she had learned from him how these pictures, any pictures, were exhibited on sale, and the painter paid, minus the commission, when the sale was made. She took good care to make it clear to the manager of Potteries that she was doing this so that Eugene could have the money, and saw to it that the check reached him promptly. If Eugene had been alone, this check of $300 would have served to bring Angela to him. As it was, it gave him funds to disport himself with in her company. He did not know that she had been the means of his getting it, or to whom the picture had been sold. A fictitious name was given. This sale somewhat restored Eugene's faith in his future, for if one of his pictures would sell so late in the day for this price, others would. There were days thereafter of the most curious composition. In the morning he would leave dressed in his old working suit and carrying his lunch box, Carlotta waving him farewell from her window, or if he had an engagement outside with Carlotta, wearing a good suit and trusting his overalls and jumper to protect it, working all day with John and Bill, or Malachi Dempsey and Joseph, for there was rivalry between these two groups as to which should have his company, or leaving the shop early and riding with her a part of the time, coming home at night to be greeted by Carlotta as though she had not seen him at all. She watched for his coming as patiently as a wife, and was as eager to see if there was anything she could do for him. In the shop, Malachi and Joseph, or John and Bill, and sometimes some of the carpenters upstairs, would complain of a rush of work in order that they might have his assistance or presence. Malachi and Joseph could always enter the complaint that they were in danger of being hampered by shavings, for the latter were constantly piling up in great heaps, beautiful shavings of ash and yellow pine and walnut, which smelled like resin and frankincense, and had the shape of girls' curls, or dry breakfast food, or rich damp sawdust. Or John and Bill would complain that they were being overworked and needed someone in the car to receive. Even Big John, the engineer, tried to figure out some scheme by which he could utilize Eugene as a fireman, but that was impossible. There was no call for any such person. The foreman understood well enough what the point was, but said nothing, placing Eugene with the particular group which seemed to need him most. Eugene was genial enough about the matter. Wherever he was right. He liked to be in the cars or on a lumber pile or in the plane room. He also liked to stand and talk to Big John or Harry Fornes, his basket under his arm, kidding as he called it. His progress to and fro was marked by endless quips and jests, and he was never weary. When his work was done at night he would hurry home, following the right bank of the little stream until he reached the path which led up to the street whereon was the Hibberdale house. On his way he would sometimes stop and study the water, its peaceful current bearing an occasional stick or straw upon its bosom, and contrasting the seeming peace of its movement with his own troubled life. The subtlety of nature as expressed in water appealed to him. The difference between this idyllic stream bank and his shop and all who were of it struck him forcefully. Malachi Dempsey had only the vaguest conception of the beauty of nature. Jack Stix was scarcely more artistic than the raw piles of lumber with which he dealt. Big John had no knowledge of the rich emotions of love or of beauty which troubled Eugene's brain. They lived on another plane, apparently. At the other end of the stream awaiting him was Carlotta, graceful, sophisticated, eager in her regard for him, lukewarm in her interest in morals, sybaritic in her moods, representing in a way a world which lived upon the fruits of this exploited toil and caring nothing about it. If he said anything to Carlotta about the condition of Joseph Mews, who carried bundles of wood home to his sister of an evening to help save the expense of fuel, she merely smiled. If he talked of the poverty of the masses, she said, "Don't be doleful, Eugene." She wanted to talk of art and luxury and love, or think of them at least. Her love of the beauty of nature was keen. There were certain inns they could reach by automobile where they could sit and dine and drink a bottle of wine or a pitcher of claret cup, and here she would muse on what they would do if they were only free. Angela was frequently in Carlotta's thoughts, persistently in Eugene's, for he could not help feeling that he was doing her a rank injustice. She had been so patient and affectionate all this long time past, had tended him as a mother, waited on him as a servant. Only recently he had been writing in the most affectionate terms, wishing she were with him. Now all that was dead again. It was hard work to write. Everything he said seemed a lie, and he did not want to say it. He hated to pretend. Still, if he did not write, Angela would be in a state of mortal agony, he thought, and would shortly come to look him up. It was only by writing, protesting his affection, explaining why in his judgment it was unadvisable for her to come at the present, that she could be made to stay where she was. And now that he was so infatuated with Carlotta, this seemed very desirable. He did not delude himself that he would ever be able to marry her. He knew that he could not get a divorce, there being no grounds, and the injustice to Angela being such a bar to his conscience. And as for Carlotta, her future was very uncertain. Norman Wilson, for all that he disregarded her at times, did not want to give her up. He was writing, threatening to come back to New York if she did not come to him, though the fact that she was in her mother's home, where he considered her safe, was some consolation to him. Angela was begging Eugene to let her come. They would get along, she argued, on whatever he got, and he would be better off with her than alone. She pictured him living in some uncomfortable boarding house where he was not half attended to and intensely lonely. Her return meant the leaving of this lovely home, for Mrs. Hibberdell had indicated that she would not like to keep him and his wife, and so the end of this perfect romance with Carlotta, an end to lovely country inns and summer balconies where they were dining together, an end to swift tours in her automobile, which she guided skillfully herself, avoiding the presence of a chauffeur, an end to lovely trysts under trees and by pretty streams where he kissed and fondled her and where she lingered joyously in his arms. "If Ma could only see us now," she would jest, or, "Do you suppose Bill and John would recognize you here if they saw you?" Once she said, "This is better than the engine room, isn't it?" "You're a bad lot, Carlotta," he would declare, and then would come to her lips the enigmatic smile of Mona Lisa. "You like bad lots, don't you? Strays make fine hunting." In her own philosophy, she was taking the cash and letting the credit go. End of section 52. Section 53 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 24. Days like this could not go on forever. The seed of their destruction was in their beginning. Eugene was sad. He used to show his mood at times, and, if she asked him what was the matter, would say, "We can't keep this thing up much longer. It must come to an end soon." "You're certainly a gloomy philosopher, Jeanie," she would say, reproachfully, for she had hopes that it could be made to last a long while under any circumstances. Eugene had the feeling that no pretense would escape Angela's psychology. She was too sensitive to his unspoken moods and feelings. She would come soon, willy-nilly, and then all this would be ended. As a matter of fact, several things combined to bring about change and conclusion. For one thing, Mrs. Hibberdell had been more and more impressed with the fact that Carlotta was not merely content to stay, but that once having come, she was fairly determined to remain. She had her own apartment in the city, ostensibly closed for the summer, for she had protested that it was too hot to live in town when she first proposed going to Narragansett. After seeing Eugene, she figured out a possible use for it, though that use was dangerous, for Norman Wilson might return at any time. Nevertheless, they had been there on occasions, this with the double effect of deceiving her mother and entertaining Eugene. If she could remain away from Riverwood a percentage of the time, she argued with Eugene, it would make her stay less suspicious and would not jeopardize their joy in companionship. So she did this. At the same time, she could not stay away from Riverwood entirely, for Eugene was there necessarily morning and evening. Nevertheless, toward the end of August, Mrs. Hibberdell was growing suspicious. She had seen an automobile entering Central Park once when Carlotta had phoned her that she had a sick headache and could not come up. It looked to Mrs. Hibberdell, who had gone downtown shopping on the strength of this ailment, and who had phoned Carlotta that she was going to call at her apartment in the evening, as though Eugene and Carlotta were in it. Eugene had gone to work that morning, which made it seem doubtful, but it certainly looked very much like him. Still, she did not feel sure it was he or Carlotta either. When she came to the latter's apartment, Carlotta was there, feeling better, but stating that she had not been out. Mrs. Hibberdell concluded thoughtfully that she must have been mistaken. Her own room was on the third floor, and several times, after all had retired, and she had come down to the kitchen or dining room or library for something, she had heard a peculiar noise as of someone walking lightly. She thought it was fancy on her part, for invariably when she reached the second floor all was dark and still. Nevertheless, she wondered whether Eugene and Carlotta could be visiting. Twice between breakfast and the time Eugene departed, she thought she heard Eugene and Carlotta whispering on the second floor, but there was no proof. Carlotta's readiness to rise for breakfast at 6:30 in order to be at the same table with Eugene was peculiar, and her giving up Narragansett for Riverwood was most significant. It remained for one real discovery to resolve all her suspicions into the substance of fact and convict Carlotta of being the most conscienceless of deceivers. It came about in this fashion. One Sunday morning Davis and Mrs. Hibberdell had decided to go automobiling. Eugene and Carlotta were invited but had refused, for Carlotta, on hearing the discussion several days before, had warned Eugene and planned to have the day for herself and her lover. She cautioned him to pretend the need of making visits downtown. As for herself, she had said she would go, but on the day in question did not feel well enough. Davis and Mrs. Hibberdell departed, their destination being Long Island. It was an all-day tour. After an hour their machine broke, however, and after sitting in it 2 hours, waiting for repairs, long enough to spoil their plans, they came back by trolley. Eugene had not gone downtown. He was not even dressed when the door opened on the ground floor and Mrs. Hibberdell came in. "Oh, Carlotta," she called, standing at the foot of the stairs and expecting Carlotta to appear from her own room or a sort of lounging and sewing room which occupied the front of the house on the second floor and where she frequently stayed. Carlotta unfortunately was with Eugene, and the door to this room was commanded from where Mrs. Hibberdell was standing. She did not dare to answer. "Oh, Carlotta," called her mother again. The latter's first thought was to go back in the kitchen and look there, but on second thoughts she ascended the steps and started for the sewing room. Carlotta thought she had entered. In an instant she had seized the opportunity to step into the bath which was next to Eugene's room, but she was scarcely quick enough. Her mother had not gone into the room, only opened the door and looked in. She did not see Carlotta step out of Eugene's room, but did see her entering the bath in negligee. and she could scarcely have come from anywhere else. Her own door, which was between Eugene's room and the sewing room, was 10 feet away. It did not seem possible that she could have come from there. She had not had time enough, and anyhow, why had she not answered? The first impulse of Mrs. Hibberdell was to call to her. Her second thought was to let the ruse seem successful. She was convinced that Eugene was in his room, and a few minutes later a monitory cough on his part, coughed for a purpose, convinced her. "Are you in the bath, Carlotta?" she called quietly, after looking into Carlotta's room. "Yes," came the reply, easily enough. "Did your machine break down?" A few remarks were exchanged through the door, and then Mrs. Hibberdell went to her room. She thought over the situation steadily, for it greatly irritated her. It was not the same as the discovered irregularity of a trusted and virtuous daughter. Carlotta had not been led astray. She was a grown woman, married, experienced. In every way she knew as much about life as her mother, in some respects more. The difference between them was in ethical standards and the policy that aligns itself with common sense, decency, self-preservation, as against its opposite. Carlotta had so much to look out for. Her future was in her own hands. Besides Eugene's future, his wife's rights and interests, her mother's home, her mother's standards, were things which she ought to respect, ought to want to respect. To find her lying as she had been this long time, pretending indifference, pretending absence, and no doubt associating with Eugene all the while, was disgusting. She was very angry, not so much at Eugene, though her respect for him was greatly lowered, artist though he was, as at Carlotta. She ought to do better. She ought to be ashamed not to guard herself against a man like Eugene, instead of luring him on. It was Carlotta's fault, and she determined to reproach her bitterly and to break up this wretched alliance at once. There was an intense and bitter quarrel the next morning, for Mrs. Hibberdell decided to hold her peace until Eugene and Davis should be out of the house. She wanted to have this out with Carlotta alone, and the clash came shortly after breakfast when both the others had left. Carlotta had already warned Eugene that something might happen on account of this, but under no circumstances was he to admit anything unless she told him to. The maid was in the kitchen out of earshot, and Mrs. Hibberdell and Carlotta were in the library when the opening gun was fired. In a way Carlotta was prepared, for she fancied her mother might have seen other things, what or how much she could not guess. She was not without the dignity of Circe, for she had been through scenes like this before. Her own husband had charged her with infidelity more than once, and she had been threatened with physical violence by him. Her face was pale but calm. "Now, Carlotta," observed her mother vigorously, "I saw what was going on yesterday morning when I came home. You were in Mr. Witla's room with your clothes off. I saw you come out. Please don't deny it. I saw you come out. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? How can you treat me that way after you promised not to do anything out of the way here?" "You didn't see me come out of his room, and I wasn't in there," said Carlotta brazenly. Her face was pale, but she was giving a fair imitation of righteous surprise. "Why do you make such statements as that?" "Why, Carlotta Hibberdell, how dare you contradict me? How dare you lie? You came out of that room. You know you did. You know that you were in there. You know that I saw you. I should think you would be ashamed of yourself, slipping about this house like a street girl and your own mother in it. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Have you no sense of decency left? Oh, Carlotta, I know you are bad, but why will you come here to be so? Why couldn't you let this man alone? He was doing well enough. It's a shame, the thing you have done. It's an outrage. Mrs. Witla ought to come here and whip you within an inch of your life." "Oh, how you talk," said Carlotta irritably. "You make me tired. You didn't see me. It's the old story, suspicion. You are always full of suspicion. You didn't see me and I wasn't in there. Why do you start a fuss for nothing?" "A fuss? A fuss for nothing? The idea, you evil woman! A fuss for nothing! How can you talk that way? I can hardly believe my senses. I can hardly believe you would dare to brazenly face me in this way. I saw you, and now you deny it." Mrs. Hibberdell had not seen her, but she was convinced that what she said was true. Carlotta brazened it out. "You didn't," she insisted. Mrs. Hibberdell stared. The effrontery of it took her breath away. "Carlotta," she exclaimed, "I honestly think you are the worst woman in the world. I can't think of you as my daughter. You are too brazen. You're the worst because you're calculating. You know what you're doing, and you are deliberate in your method of doing it. You're evil-minded. You know exactly what you want, and you set out deliberately to get it. You have done it in this case. You started out to get this man, and you have succeeded in doing it. You have no sense of shame, no pride, no honesty, no honor, no respect for me or anyone else. You do not love this man. You know you don't. If you did, you would never degrade him and yourself and me as you have done. You've simply indulged in another vile relationship because you wanted to. And now when you're caught you brazen it out. You're evil, Carlotta. You're as low as a woman can be, even if you are my daughter." "It isn't true," said Carlotta. "You're just talking to hear yourself talk." "It is true, and you know it," reproved her mother. "You talk about Norman. He never did a thing worse in his life than you have done. He may be a gambler and immoral and inconsiderate and selfish. What are you? Can you stand there and tell me you're any better? Pah! If you only had a sense of shame, something could be done for you, but you haven't any. You're just vile, that's all." "How you talk, Ma," she observed calmly. "How you carry on. And that on mere suspicion. You didn't see me. I might have been in there, but you didn't see me, and I wasn't. You're making a storm just because you want to. I like Mr. Witla. I think he's very nice, but I'm not interested in him, and I haven't done anything to harm him. You can turn him out if you want to. That's none of my affairs. You're simply raging about as usual without any facts to go upon." Carlotta stared at her mother, thinking. She was not greatly disturbed. It was pretty bad, no doubt of that, but she was not thinking so much of that as of the folly of being found out. Her mother knew for certain, though she would not admit to her that she knew. Now all this fine summer romance would end. The pleasant convenience of it, anyhow. Eugene would be put to the trouble of moving. Her mother might say something disagreeable to him. Besides, she knew she was better than Norman because she did not associate with the same evil type of people. She was not coarse. She was not thick-witted. She was not cruel. And she was not a user of vile language or an expresser of vile ideas. And Norman was at times. She might lie and she might be calculating, but not to anyone's disadvantage. She was simply passion-driven, boldly so, and only toward love or romance. "Am I evil?" she often asked herself. Her mother said she was evil. Well, she was in one way, but her mother was angry, that was all. She did not mean all she said. She would come around. Still Carlotta did not propose to admit the truth of her mother's charges, or go through the situation without some argument. There were charges which her mother was making which were untenable, points which were inexcusable. "Carlotta Hibberdell, you're the most brazen creature I ever knew. You're a terrible liar. How can you stand there and look me in the eye and say that when you know that I know? Why lie in addition to everything else? Oh, Carlotta, the shame of it! If you only had some sense of honor. How can you lie like that? How can you?" "I'm not lying," declared Carlotta, "and I wish you would quit fussing. You didn't see me. You know you didn't. I came out of my room and you were in the front room. Why do you say you weren't? You didn't see me. Supposing I am a liar. I'm your daughter. I may be vile. I didn't make myself so. Certainly I'm not in this instance. Whatever I am, I come by it honestly. My life hasn't been a bed of roses. Why do you start such a silly fight? You haven't got a thing to go on except suspicion, and now you want to raise a row. I don't care what you think of me. I'm not guilty in this case, and you can think what you please. You ought to be ashamed to charge me with something of which you are not sure." She walked to the window and stared out. Her mother shook her head. Such effrontery was beyond her. It was like her daughter, though. she took after her father and herself. Both were self-willed and determined when aroused. At the same time, she was sorry for her girl, for Carlotta was a capable woman in her way and very much dissatisfied with life. "I should think you would be ashamed of yourself, Carlotta, whether you admit it to me or not," she went on. "The truth is the truth, and it must hurt you a little. You were in that room. We won't argue that, though. You set out deliberately to do this, and you have done it. Now, what I have to say is this. You are going back to your apartment today, and Mr. Witla is going to leave here as quick as he can get a room somewhere else. You're not going to continue this wretched relationship any longer if I can help it. I'm going to write to his wife, and to Norman, too. If I can't do anything else to break this up, you're going to let this man alone. You have no right to come between him and Mrs. Witla. It's an outrage, and no one but a vile, conscienceless woman would do it. I'm not going to say anything to him now, but he's going to leave here, and so are you. When it's all over, you can come back if you want to. I'm ashamed for you. I'm ashamed for myself. If it hadn't been for my own feelings and those of Davis, I would have ordered you both out of the house yesterday, and you know it. It's consideration for myself that's made me smooth it over as much as I have. He, the vile thing, after all the courtesy I have shown him. Still, I don't blame him as much as I do you, for he would never have looked at you if you hadn't made him. My own daughter, my own house." There was more conversation, that fulgurous, coruscating reiteration of charges. Eugene was no good. Carlotta was vile. Mrs. Hibberdell wouldn't have believed it possible if she hadn't seen it with her own eyes. She was going to tell Norman if Carlotta didn't reform, over and over, one threat after another. "Well," she said finally, "you're going to get your things ready and go into the city this afternoon. I'm not going to have you here another day." "No, I'm not," said Carlotta boldly, pondering over all that had been said. It was a terrible ordeal, but she would not go today. "I'm going in the morning. I'm not going to pack that fast. It's too late. I'm not going to be ordered out of here like a servant." Her mother groaned, but she gave in. Carlotta could not be made to do anything she did not want to do. She went to her room, and presently Mrs. Hibberdell heard her singing. She shook her head. Such a personality! No wonder Eugene succumbed to her blandishments. What man wouldn't? End of section 53. Section 54 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 25. The sequel of this scene was not to be waited for. At dinner time, Mrs. Hibberdell announced in the presence of Carlotta and Davis that the house was going to be closed up for the present, and very quickly. She and Carlotta were going to Narragansett for the month of September and a part of October. Eugene, having been forewarned by Carlotta, took it with a show of polite surprise. He was sorry. He had spent such a pleasant time here. Mrs. Hibberdell could not be sure whether Carlotta had told him or not. He seemed so innocent. But she assumed that she had, and that he, like Carlotta, was putting on. She had informed Davis that for reasons of her own she wanted to do this. He suspected what they were, for he had seen signs and slight demonstrations which convinced him that Carlotta and Eugene had reached an understanding. He did not consider it anything very much amiss, for Carlotta was a woman of the world, her own boss, and a good fellow. She had always been nice to him. He did not want to put any obstacles in her way. In addition, he liked Eugene. Once he had said to Carlotta jestingly, "Well, his arms are almost as long as Norman's. Not quite, maybe." "You go to the devil," was her polite reply. Tonight a storm came up, a brilliant, flashing summer storm. Eugene went out on the porch to watch it. Carlotta came also. "Well, wise man," she said, as the thunder rolled, "it's all over up here. Don't let on. I'll see you wherever you go. But this was so nice. It was fine to have you near me. Don't get blue, will you?" She says she may write your wife, but I don't think she will. If she thinks I'm behaving, she won't. I'll try and fool her. It's too bad, though. I'm crazy about Eugenie." Now that he was in danger of losing Carlotta, her beauty took on a special significance for Eugene. He had come into such close contact with her, he had seen her under such varied conditions, that he had come to feel a profound admiration for not only her beauty, but her intellect and ability as well. One of his weaknesses was that he was inclined to see much more in those he admired than was really there. He endowed them with the romance of his own moods, saw in them the ability to do things which he only could do. In doing this, of course, he flattered their vanity, aroused their self-confidence, made them feel themselves the possessors of latent powers and forces which before him they had only dreamed of. Margaret, Ruby, Angela, Christina, and Carlotta had all gained this feeling from him. They had a better opinion of themselves for having known him. Now, as he looked at Carlotta, he was intensely sorry, for she was so calm, so affable, so seemingly efficient and self-reliant, and such a comfort to him in these days. "Circe," he said, "this is too bad. I'm sorry. I'm going to hate to lose you." "You won't lose me," she replied. "You can't. I won't let you. I've found you now, and I'm going to keep you. This don't mean anything. We can find places to meet. Get a place where they have a phone if you can. When do you think you'll go?" "Right away," said Eugene. "I'll take tomorrow morning off and look." "Poor Eugene," she said sympathetically. "It's too bad. Never mind, though. Everything will come out right." She was still not counting on Angela. She thought that even if Angela came back, as Eugene told her she would soon, a joint arrangement might possibly be made. Angela could be here, but she, Carlotta, could share Eugene in some way. She thought she would rather live with him than any other man on earth. It was only about noon the next morning when Eugene had found another room, for in living here so long he had thought of several methods by which he might have obtained a room in the first place. There was another church, a library, the postmaster and the ticket agent at Spionk, who lived in the village. He went first to the postmaster and learned of two families. One, the home of a civil engineer, where he might be welcome, and it was here that he eventually settled. The view was not quite so attractive, but it was charming, and he had a good room and good meals. He told them that he might not stay long, for his wife was coming back soon. The letters from Angela were becoming most importunate. He gathered up his belongings at Mrs. Hibberdell's and took a polite departure. After he was gone, Mrs. Hibberdell, of course, changed her mind, and Carlotta returned to her apartment in New York. She communicated with Eugene not only by phone, but by special delivery, and had him meet her at a convenient inn the second evening of his departure. She was planning some sort of a separate apartment for them, when Eugene informed her that Angela was already on her way to New York, and that nothing could be done at present. Since Eugene had left her at Biloxi, Angela had spent a most miserable period of 7 months. She had been grieving her heart out, for she imagined him to be most lonely, and at the same time she was regretful that she had ever left him. She might as well have been with him. She figured afterward that she might have borrowed several $100s from one of her brothers, and carried out the fight for his mental recovery by his side. Once he had gone, she fancied she might have made a mistake matrimonially, for he was so impressionable, but his condition was such that she did not deem him to be interested in anything save his recovery. Besides, his attitude toward her of late had been so affectionate and in a way dependent. All her letters since he had left had been most tender, speaking of his sorrow at this necessary absence and hoping that the time would soon come when they could be together. The fact that he was lonely finally decided her, and she wrote that she was coming, whether he wanted her to or not. Her arrival would have made little difference, except by now he was thoroughly weaned away from her again, had obtained a new ideal, and was interested only to see and be with Carlotta. The latter's easy financial state, her nice clothes, her familiarity with comfortable and luxurious things, better things than Eugene had ever dreamed of enjoying, her use of the automobile, her freedom in the matter of expenditures, taking the purchase of champagne and expensive meals as a matter of course, dazzled and fascinated him. It was rather an astonishing thing, he thought, to have so fine a woman fall in love with him. Besides, her tolerance, her indifference to petty conventions, her knowledge of life and literature and art set her in marked contrast to Angela, and in all ways she seemed rare and forceful to him. He wished from his heart that he could be free and could have her. Into this peculiar situation Angela precipitated herself one bright Saturday afternoon in September. She was dying to see Eugene again, full of grave thoughts for his future. She had come to share it, whatever it might be. Her one idea was that he was sick and depressed and lonely. None of his letters had been cheerful or optimistic, for of course he did not dare to confess the pleasure he was having in Carlotta's company. In order to keep her away, he had to pretend the lack of funds made it inadmissible for her to be here. The fact that he was spending, and by the time she arrived had spent, nearly the whole of the $300 his picture sold to Carlotta had brought him, had troubled him. Not unduly, of course, or he would not have done it. He had qualms of conscience, severe ones, but they passed with the presence of Carlotta or the reading of his letters from Angela. "I don't know what's the matter with me," he said to himself from time to time. "I guess I'm no good." He thought it was a blessing that the world could not see him as he was. One of the particular weaknesses of Eugene's, which should be set forth here, and which will help to illuminate the basis of his conduct, was that he was troubled with a dual point of view, a condition based upon a peculiar power of analysis, self-analysis in particular, which was constantly permitting him to tear himself up by the roots in order to see how he was getting along. He would daily and hourly, when not otherwise employed, lift the veil from his inner mental processes, as he might lift the covering from a well, and peer into its depths. What he saw was not very inviting and vastly disconcerting. A piece of machinery that was not going as a true man should, clock fashion, and corresponding in none of its moral characteristics to the recognized standard of a man. He had concluded by now, from watching various specimens, that sane men were honest, some inherently moral, some regulated by a keen sense of duty, and occasionally all of these virtues and others were bound up in one man. Angela's father was such a one. Monsieur Charles appeared to be another. He had concluded from his association with Jerry Matthews, Philip Shotmeyer, Peter McHugh, and Joseph Smite that they were all rather decent in respect to morals. He had never seen them under temptation, but he imagined they were. Such a man as William Haverford, the engineer of maintenance of way, and Henry C. Littlebrown, the division engineer of this immense road, struck him as men who must have stuck close to a sense of duty and the conventions of the life they represented, working hard all the time to have obtained the positions they had. All this whole railroad system, which he was watching closely from day to day, from his little vantage point of connection with it, seemed a clear illustration of the need of a sense of duty and reliability. All of these men who worked for this company had to be in good health. All had to appear at their posts on the tick of the clock. All had to perform faithfully the duties assigned them, or there would be disasters. Many of them had climbed by long, arduous years of work to very modest positions of prominence, as conductors, engineers, foremen, division superintendents. Others more gifted or more blessed by fortune had become division engineers, superintendents, vice presidents, and presidents. They were all slow climbers, rigid in their sense of duty, tireless in their energy, exact, thoughtful. What was he? He looked into the well of his being, and there he saw nothing but shifty and uncertain currents. It was very dark down there. He was not honest, he said to himself, except in money matters. He often wondered why. He was not truthful. He was not moral. This love of beauty which haunted him seemed much more important than anything else in the world, and his pursuit of that seemed to fly in the face of everything else which was established and important. He found that men everywhere did not think much of a man who was crazy after women. They might joke about an occasional lapse as an amiable vice or one which could be condoned, but they wanted little to do with a man who was overpowered by it. There was a case over in the railroad yard at Speonk recently which he had noted, of a foreman who had left his wife and gone after some hoyden in White Plains, and because of this offense he was promptly discharged. It appeared, though, that before this he had occasionally had such lapses, and that each time he had been discharged, but had been subsequently forgiven. This one weakness and no other had given him a bad reputation among his fellow railroad men, much as that a drunkard might have. Big John Peters, the engineer, had expressed it aptly to Eugene one day when he told him in confidence that Ed Bowers would go to hell for his hide, the latter being the local expression for women. Everybody seemed to pity him, and the man seemed in a way to pity himself. He had a hangdog look when he was reinstated, and yet everybody knew that apart from this he was a fairly competent foreman. Still, it was generally understood that he would never get anywhere. From that Eugene argued to himself that a man who was cursed with this peculiar vice could not get anywhere, that he, if he kept it up, would not. It was like drinking and stealing, and the face of the world was against it. Very frequently it went hand in hand with those things, birds of a feather, he thought. Still he was cursed with it, and he no more than Ed Bowers appeared to be able to conquer it. At least he was yielding to it now, as he had before. It mattered not that the women he chose were exceptionally beautiful and fascinating. They were women, and ought he to want them? He had one. He had taken a solemn vow to love and cherish her, or at least had gone through the formality of such a vow, and here he was running about with Carlotta, as he had with Christina and Ruby before her. Was he not always looking for such women as this? Certainly he was. Had he not far better be seeking for wealth, distinction, a reputation for probity, chastity, impeccable moral honor? Certainly he had. It was the way to distinction, apparently, assuming the talent, and here he was doing anything but take that way. Conscience was his barrier, a conscience unmodified by a cold self-interest. Shame upon himself, shame upon his weak-kneed disposition, not to be able to recover from this illusion of beauty. Such were some of the thoughts which his moments of introspection brought him. On the other hand, there came over him the other phase of his duality, the ability to turn this terrible searchlight of intelligence which swept the heavens and the deep as with a great white ray upon the other side of the question. It revealed constantly the inexplicable subtleties and seeming injustice of nature. He could not help seeing how the big fish fed upon the little ones. The strong were constantly using the weak as pawns. The thieves, the grafters, the murderers were sometimes allowed to prey on society without let or hindrance. Good was not always rewarded, frequently terribly ill rewarded. Evil was seen to flourish beautifully at times. It was all right to say that it would be punished, but would it? Carlotta did not think so. She did not think the thing she was doing with him was very evil. She had said to him over and over that it was an open question, that he was troubled with an ingrowing conscience. "I don't think it's so bad," she once told him. "It depends somewhat on how you were raised." There was a system apparently in society, but apparently it did not work very well. Only fools were held by religion, which in the main was an imposition, a graft, and a lie. The honest man might be very fine, but he wasn't very successful. There was a great to do about morals, but most people were immoral or unmoral. Why worry? Look to your health. Don't let a morbid conscience get the better of you. Thus she counseled, and he agreed with her. For the rest, the survival of the fittest was the best. Why should he worry? He had talent. It was thus that Eugene floundered to and fro, and it was in this state, brooding and melancholy, that Angela found him on her arrival. He was as gay as ever at times when he was not thinking, but he was very thin and hollow-eyed, and Angela fancied that it was overwork and worry which kept him in this state. Why had she left him? Poor Eugene! She had clung desperately to the money he had given her, and had most of it with her, ready to be expended now for his care. She was so anxious for his recovery and his peace of mind that she was ready to go to work herself at anything she could find in order to make his path more easy. She was thinking that fate was terribly unjust to him, and when he had gone to sleep beside her the first night, she lay awake and cried. Poor Eugene! To think he should be tried so by fate! Nevertheless, he should not be tortured by anything which she could prevent. She was going to make him as comfortable and happy as she could. She set about to find some nice little apartment or rooms where they could live in peace and where she could cook Eugene's meals for him. She fancied that maybe his food had not been exactly right, and when she got him where she could manifest a pretense of self-confidence and courage, that he would take courage from her and grow better. So she set briskly about her task, honeying Eugene the while, for she was confident that this above all things was the thing he needed. She little suspected what a farce it all appeared to him, how mean and contemptible he appeared to himself. He did not care to be mean, to rapidly disillusion her and go his way, and yet this dual existence sickened him. He could not help but feel that from a great many points of view Angela was better than Carlotta. Yet the other woman was wider in her outlook, more gracious in her appearance, more commanding, more subtle. She was a princess of the world, subtle, deadly Machiavellian, but a princess nevertheless. Angela was better described by the current and acceptable phrase of the time, a thoroughly good woman, honest, energetic, resourceful, in all things obedient to the race spirit and the conventional feelings of the time. He knew that society would support her thoroughly and condemn Carlotta, and yet Carlotta interested him more. He wished that he might have both and no fussing. Then all would be beautiful. So he thought. End of section 54. Section 55 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 26. The situation which here presented itself was subject to no such gracious and generous development. Angela was the soul of watchfulness, insistence on duty, consideration for right conduct and for the privileges, opportunities, and emoluments which belonged to her as the wife of a talented artist, temporarily disabled, it is true, but certainly to be distinguished in the future. She was deluding herself that his recent experience of reverses had probably hardened and sharpened Eugene's practical instincts, made him less indifferent to the necessity of looking out for himself, giving him keener instincts of self-protection and economy. He had done very well to live on so little, she thought, but they were going to do better. They were going to save. She was going to give up those silly dreams she had entertained of a magnificent studio and hosts of friends. She was going to start now saving a fraction of whatever they made, however small it might be, if it were only 10 cents a week. If Eugene could only make $9 a week by working every day, they were going to live on that. He still had 97 out of the $100 he had brought with him, he told her, and this was going in the bank. He did not tell her of the sale of one of his pictures and of the subsequent dissipation of the proceeds. In the bank, too, they were going to put any money from subsequent sales until he was on his feet again. One of these days, if they ever made any money, they were going to buy a house somewhere in which they could live without paying rent. Some of the money in the bank, a very little of it, might go for clothes if worse came to worse, but it would not be touched unless it was absolutely necessary. She needed clothes now, but that did not matter. To Eugene's 97 was added Angela's 228, which she brought with her, and this total sum of $325 was promptly deposited in the Bank of Riverwood. Angela, by personal energy and explanation, found 4 rooms in the house of a furniture manufacturer. It had been vacated by a daughter who had married, and they were glad to let it to an artist and his wife for practically nothing so far as real worth was concerned. For this was a private house in a lovely lawn. $12 per month was the charge. Mrs. Witla seemed very charming to Miss DeCenas, who was the wife of the manufacturer, and for her especial benefit a little bedroom on the second floor adjoining a bath was turned into a kitchen, with a small gas stove, and Angela at once began housekeeping operations on the tiny basis necessitated by their income. Some furniture had to be secured, for the room was not completely furnished, but Angela, by haunting the second-hand stores in New York, looking through all the department stores, and visiting certain private sales, managed to find a few things which she could buy cheaply and which would fit in with the dressing table, library table, dining table, and one bed which were already provided. The necessary curtains for the bath and kitchen windows she cut, decorated, and hung for herself. She went down to the storage company, where the unsold and undisplayed portion of Eugene's pictures were, and brought back 7, which she placed in the general living room and dining room. All Eugene's clothes, his underwear and socks particularly, received her immediate attention, and she soon had his rather attenuated wardrobe in good condition. From the local market she bought good vegetables and a little meat, and made delightful stews, ragouts, combinations of eggs and tasty meat juices after the French fashion. All her housekeeping art was employed to the utmost to make everything look clean and neat. To maintain a bountiful supply of varied food on the table, and yet to keep the costs down, so that they could not only live on $9 a week, but set aside $1 or more of that for what Angela called their private bank account. She had a little hollow brown jug calculated to hold $15 in change, which could be opened when full, which she conscientiously endeavored to fill and refill. Her one desire was to rehabilitate her husband in the eyes of the world, this time to stay, and she was determined to do it. For another thing, reflection and conversation with one person and another had taught her that it was not well for herself or for Eugene for her to encourage him in his animal passions. Some woman in Blackwood had pointed out a local case of locomotor ataxia, which had resulted from lack of self-control, and she had learned that it was believed that many other nervous troubles sprang from the same source. Perhaps Eugene's had. She had resolved to protect him from himself. She did not believe she could be injured, but Eugene was so sensitive, so emotional. The trouble with the situation was that it was such a sharp change from his recent free and to him delightful mode of existence that it was almost painful. He could see that everything appeared to be satisfactory to her, that she thought all his days had been moral and full of hard work. Carlotta's presence in the background was not suspected. Her idea was that they would work hard together, now along simple, idealistic lines, to the one end, success for him and of course by reflection for her. Eugene saw the charm of it well enough, but it was only as something quite suitable for others. He was an artist. The common laws of existence could not reasonably apply to an artist. The latter should have intellectual freedom, the privilege of going where he pleased, associating with whom he chose. This marriage business was a galling yoke, cutting off all rational opportunity for enjoyment. and he was now, after a brief period of freedom, having that yoke heavily adjusted to his neck again. Gone were all the fine dreams of pleasure and happiness which so recently had been so real. The hope of living with Carlotta, the hope of associating with her on easy and natural terms in that superior world which she represented. Angela's insistence on the thought that he should work every day and bring home $9 a week, or rather its monthly equivalent, made it necessary for him to take sharp care of the little money he had kept out of the remainder of the 300 in order to supply any deficiency which might occur from his taking time off. For there was no opportunity now of seeing Carlotta of an evening, and it was necessary to take a regular number of afternoons or mornings off each week in order to meet her. He would leave the little apartment as usual at 6:45 in the morning, dressed suitably for possible outdoor expeditions. For in the anticipation of difficulty he had told Angela that it was his custom to do this, and sometimes he would go to the factory and sometimes he would not. There was a car line which carried him rapidly cityward to a rendezvous, and he would either ride or walk with her as the case might be. There was constant thought on his and her part of the risk involved, but still they persisted. By some stroke of ill or good fortune, Norman Wilson returned from Chicago, so that Carlotta's movements had to be calculated to a nicety, but she did not care. She trusted most to the automobiles which she could hire at convenient garages, and which would carry them rapidly away from the vicinity where they might be seen and recognized. It was a tangled life, difficult and dangerous. There was no peace in it, for there is neither peace nor happiness in deception. A burning joy at one time was invariably followed by a disturbing remorse afterward. There was Carlotta's mother, Norman Wilson and Angela to guard against, to say nothing of the constant pricking of his own conscience. It is almost a foregone conclusion in any situation of this kind that it cannot endure. The seed of its undoing is in itself. We think that our actions, when unseen of mortal eyes, resolve themselves into nothingness, but this is not true. They are woven indefinably into our being, and shine forth ultimately as the real self, in spite of all our pretenses. One could almost accept the Brahmanistic dogma of psychic body, which sees and is seen where we dream all to be darkness. There is no other supposition on which to explain the facts of intuition. So many individuals have it. They know so well without knowing why they know. Angela had this intuitive power in connection with Eugene. Because of her great affection for him, she divined, or apprehended, many things in connection with him long before they occurred. Throughout her absence from him, she had been haunted by the idea that she ought to be with him. And now that she was here, and the first excitement of contact and adjustment was over, she was beginning to be aware of something. Eugene was not the same as he had been a little while before he had left her. His attitude, in spite of a kindly show of affection, was distant and preoccupied. He had no real power of concealing anything. He appeared at times, at most times when he was with her, to be lost in a mist of speculation. He was lonely and a little lovesick, because under the pressure of home affairs Carlotta was not able to see him quite so much. At the same time, now that the fall was coming on, he was growing weary of the shop at Speonk, for the gray days and slight chill which settled upon the earth at times caused the shop windows to be closed and robbed the yard of that air of romance which had characterized it when he first came there. He could not take his way of an evening along the banks of the stream to the arms of Carlotta. The novelty of Big John and Joseph Mews and Malachi Dempsey and little Sudsy had worn off. He was beginning now to see also that they were nothing but plain working men after all, worrying over the fact that they were not getting more than 15 or 17½ cents an hour, jealous of each other and their superiors, full of all the frailties and weaknesses to which the flesh is heir. His coming had created a slight diversion for them, for he was very strange, but his strangeness was no longer a novelty. They were beginning to see him also as a relatively commonplace human being. He was an artist, to be sure, but his actions and intentions were not so vastly different from those of other men. A shop of this kind, like any other institution, where people are compelled by force of circumstances to work together, whether the weather be fair or foul, or the mood grave or gray, can readily become, and frequently does become, a veritable hell. Human nature is a subtle, irritable, irrational thing. It is not so much governed by rules of ethics and conditions of understanding as a thing of moods and temperament. Eugene could easily see, philosopher that he was, that these people would come here enveloped in some mist of home trouble or secret illness or grief, and would conceive that somehow it was not their state of mind, but the things around them which were the cause of all their woe. Sour looks would breed sour looks in return. A gruff question would beget a gruff answer. There were long-standing grudges between one man and another, based on nothing more than a grouchy observation at one time in the past. He thought by introducing gaiety and persistent, if make-believe, geniality that he was tending to obviate and overcome the general condition. But this was only relatively true. His own gaiety was capable of becoming as much of a weariness to those who were out of the spirit of it, as was the sour brutality with which at times he was compelled to contend. So he wished that he might arrange to get well and get out of here, or at least change his form of work, for it was plain to be seen that this condition would not readily improve. His presence was a commonplace. His power to entertain and charm was practically gone. This situation, coupled with Angela's spirit of honest conservatism, was bad, but it was destined to be much worse. From watching him and endeavoring to decipher his moods, Angela came to suspect something. She could not say what. He did not love her as much as he had. There was a coolness in his caresses which was not there when he left her. What could have happened, she asked herself. Was it just absence, or what? One day, when he had returned from an afternoon's outing with Carlotta and was holding her in his arms in greeting, she asked him solemnly, "Do you love me, honey bun?" "You know I do," he asseverated, but without any energy, for he could not regain his old original feeling for her. There was no trace of it, only sympathy, pity, and a kind of sorrow that she was being so badly treated after all her efforts. "No, you don't," she replied, detecting the hollow ring in what he had said. Her voice was sad, and her eyes showed traces of that wistful despair into which she could so readily sink at times. "Why, yes, I do, Angel Face," he insisted. "What makes you ask? What's come over you?" He was wondering whether she had heard anything or seen anything, and was concealing her knowledge behind this preliminary inquiry. "Nothing," she replied, "only you don't love me. I don't know what it is. I don't know why. But I can feel it right here," and she laid her hand on her heart. The action was sincere, unstudied. It hurt him, for it was like that of a little child. "Oh, hush! Don't say that," he pleaded. "You know I do. Don't look so gloomy. I love you. Don't you know I do?" And he kissed her. "No, no," said Angela. "I know you don't. Oh, dear, I feel so bad." Eugene was dreading another display of the hysteria with which he was familiar, but it did not come. She conquered her mood, inasmuch as she had no real basis for suspicion, and went about the work of getting his dinner. She was depressed, though, and he was fearful. What if she should ever find out? More days passed. Carlotta called him up at the shop occasionally, for there was no phone where he lived, and she would not have risked it if there had been. She sent him registered notes to be signed for, addressed to Henry Kingsland, and directed to the post office at Speonk. Eugene was not known there as Witla, and easily secured these missives, which were usually very guarded in their expressions and concerned appointments, the vaguest, most mysterious directions which he understood. They made arrangements largely from meeting to meeting, saying, "If I can't keep it Thursday at 2, it will be Friday at the same time, and if not then, Saturday." If anything happens, I'll send you a registered special." So it went on. One noontime Eugene walked down to the little post office at Speonk to look for a letter, for Carlotta had not been able to meet him the previous day, and had phoned instead that she would write the following day. He found it safely enough, and after glancing at it contained but a few words, decided to tear it up as usual and throw the pieces away. A mere expression, "Ashes of Roses," which she sometimes used to designate herself, and the superscription, "Oh, Genie," made it, however, inexpressibly dear to him. He thought he would hold it in his possession just a little while. A few hours longer. It was enigmatic enough to anyone but himself, he thought, even if found. The bridge, 2 Wednesday. The bridge referred to was the one over the Harlem at Morris Heights. He kept the appointment that day as requested, but by some necromancy of fate he forgot the letter until he was within his own door. Then he took it out, tore it up into 4 or 5 pieces quickly, put it in his vest pocket, and went upstairs, intending at the first opportunity to dispose of it. Meanwhile Angela, for the first time since they had been living at Riverwood, had decided to walk over toward the factory about 6 o'clock and meet Eugene on his way home. She heard him discourse on the loveliness of this stream, and what a pleasure it was to stroll along its banks morning and evening. He was so fond of the smooth water and the overhanging leaves. She had walked with him there already on several Sundays. When she went this evening, she thought what a pleasant surprise it would be for him, for she had prepared everything on leaving so that his supper would not be delayed when they reached home. She heard the whistle blow as she neared the shop, and, standing behind a clump of bushes on the thither side of the stream, she waited, expecting to pounce out on Eugene with a loving "Boo." He did not come. The 40 or 50 men who worked here trickled out like a little stream of black ants, and then, Eugene not appearing, Angela went over to the gate which Joseph Mews, in the official capacity of gateman, after the whistle blew, was closing. "Is Mr. Witla here?" asked Angela, peering through the bars at him. Eugene had described Joseph so accurately to her that she recognized him at sight. "No, ma'am," replied Joseph, quite taken back by this attractive arrival, for good-looking women were not common at the shop gate of the factory. "He left 4 or 5 hours ago. I think he left at 1 o'clock, if I remember right. He wasn't working with us today. He was working out in the yard." "You don't know where he went, do you?" asked Angela, who was surprised at this novel information. Eugene had not said anything about going anywhere. Where could he have gone? "No, ma'am, I don't," replied Joseph volubly. "He sometimes goes off this way. Quite frequent, ma'am. His wife calls him up, now, and maybe you're his wife." "I am," said Angela, but she was no longer thinking of what she was saying. Her words on the instant were becoming mechanical. Eugene going away frequently? He had never said anything to her. His wife calling him up? Could there be another woman? Instantly her old suspicions, jealousies, fears awoke, and she was wondering why she had not fixed on this fact before. That explained Eugene's indifference, of course. That explained his air of abstraction. He wasn't thinking of her, the miserable creature. He was thinking of someone else. Still, she could not be sure, for she had no proof. 2 adroit questions elicited the fact that no one in the shop had ever seen his wife. He had just gone out. A woman had called up. Angela took her way home amid a whirling fire of conjecture. When she reached it, Eugene was not there yet, for he sometimes delayed his coming, lingering, as he said, to look at the water. It was natural enough in an artist. She went upstairs and hung the broad-brimmed straw she had worn in the closet, and went into the kitchen to await his coming. Experience with him and the nature of her own temperament determined her to enact a role of subtlety. She would wait until he spoke, pretending that she had not been out. She would ask whether he had a hard day, and see whether he disclosed the fact that he had been away from the factory. That would show her positively what he was doing,
and whether he was deliberately deceiving her. Eugene came up the stairs, gay enough, but anxious to deposit the scraps of paper where they would not be seen. No opportunity came, for Angela was there to greet him. "Did you have a hard job today?" she asked, noting that he made no preliminary announcement of any absence. "Not very," he replied. "No, I don't look tired." "No," she said bitterly, but concealing her feelings. She wanted to see how thoroughly and deliberately he would lie. "But I thought maybe you might have. Did you stop to look at the water tonight?" "Yes," he replied smoothly. "It's very lovely over there. I never get tired of it. The sun on the leaves these days, now that they are turning yellow, is so beautiful. They look a little like stained glass at certain angles." Her first impulse after hearing this was to exclaim, "Why do you lie to me, Eugene?" For her temper was fiery, almost uncontrollable at times, but she restrained herself. She wanted to find out more how she did not know, but time, if she could only wait a little, would help her. Eugene went to the bath, congratulating himself on the ease of his escape, the comfortable fact that he was not catechised very much. But in this temporary feeling of satisfaction he forgot the scraps of paper in his vest pocket, though not for long. He hung his coat and vest on a hook and started into the bedroom to get himself a fresh collar and tie. While he was in there, Angela passed the bathroom door. She was always interested in Eugene's clothes, how they were wearing, but tonight there were other thoughts in her mind. Hastily and by intuition she went through his pockets, finding the torn scraps, then for excuse took his coat and vest down to clean certain spots. At the same moment Eugene thought of his letter. He came hurrying out to get it, or the pieces, rather, but Angela already had them and was looking at them curiously. "What was that?" she asked, all her suspicious nature on the qui vive for additional proof. Why should he keep the torn fragments of letter in his pocket? For days she had had a psychic sense of something impending. Everything about him seemed strangely to call for investigation. Now it was all coming out. "Nothing," he said nervously. "A memorandum. Throw it in the paper box." Angela noted the peculiarity of his voice and manner. She was taken by the guilty expression of his eyes. Something was wrong. It concerned these scraps of paper. Maybe it was in these she would be able to read the riddle of his conduct. The woman's name might be in here. Like a flash it came to her that she might piece these scraps together, but there was another thought equally swift which urged her to pretend indifference. That might help her. Pretend now and she would know more later. She threw them in the paper box, thinking to piece them together at her leisure. Eugene noted her hesitation, her suspicion. He was afraid she would do something, what he could not guess. He breathed more easily when the papers fluttered into the practically empty box. But he was nervous. If they were only burned! He did not think she would attempt to put them together, but he was afraid. He would have given anything if his sense of romance had not led him into this trap. End of section 55. Section 56 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 27. Angela was quick to act upon her thought. No sooner had Eugene entered the bath than she gathered up the pieces, threw other bits of paper like them in their place, and tried quickly to piece them together on the ironing board where she was. It was not difficult. The scraps were not small. On one triangular bit were the words, "Oh, Jeannie," with a colon after it. On another the words, "The Bridge," and another, "Roses." There was no doubt in her mind from this preliminary survey that this was a love note, and every nerve in her body tingled to the terrible import of it. Could it really be true? Could Eugene have found someone else? Was this the cause of his coolness and his hypocritical pretense of affection, and not of his wanting her to come to him? Oh God! Would her suffering never cease? She hurried into the front room. her face white, her hand clenching the telltale bits, and there set to work to complete her task. It did not take her long. In 4 minutes it was all together, and then she saw it all. A love note from some demon of a woman. No doubt of it. Some mysterious woman in the background. Ashes of roses. Now God curse her for a siren, a love thief, a hypnotizing snake, fascinating men with her evil eyes. And Eugene, the dog, the scoundrel, the vile coward, the traitor. Was there no decency, no morality, no kindness, no gratitude in his soul? After all her patience, all her suffering, all her loneliness, her poverty, to treat her like this, writing that he was sick and lonely and unable to have her with him, and at the same time running around with a strange woman. Ashes of roses. Oh, curses, curses, curses on her harlot's heart and brain. Might God strike her dead for her cynical, brutal seizing upon that sacred possession which belonged to another. She wrung her hands desperately. Angela was fairly beside herself. Through her dainty little head ran a foaming torrent of rage, hate, envy, sorrow, self-commiseration, brutal desire for revenge. If she could only get at this woman! If she could only denounce Eugene now to his face! If she could only find them together and kill them! How she would like to strike her on the mouth! How to tear her hair and her eyes out! Something of the forest cat's cruel rage shone in her gleaming eyes as she thought of her. For if she could have Carlotta there alone, she would have tortured her with hot irons, torn her tongue and teeth from their roots, beaten her into insensibility and an unrecognizable mass. She was a real tigress now, her eyes gleaming, her red lips wet. She would kill her, kill her, kill her. As God was judge, she would kill her if she could find her, and Eugene and herself. Yes, yes, she would. Better death than this agony of suffering. Better 1,000 times to be dead with this beast of a woman dead beside her and Eugene, than to suffer this way. She didn't deserve it. Why did God torture her so? Why was she made to bleed at every step by this her sacrificial love? Had she not been a good wife? Had she not laid every tribute of tenderness, patience, and self-abnegation, self-sacrifice, and virtue on the altar of love? What more could God ask? What more could man want? Had she not waited on Eugene in sickness and health? She had gone without clothes, gone without friends, hidden herself away in Blackwood the 7 months while he was here, frittering away his health and time in love and immorality. And what was her reward? In Chicago, in Tennessee, in Mississippi, had she not waited on him, sat up with him of nights, walked the floor with him when he was nervous, consoled him in his fear of poverty and failure? And here she was now, after 7 long months of patient waiting and watching, eating her lonely heart out, forsaken. Oh, the inconceivable inhumanity of the human heart! To think anybody could be so vile, so low, so unkind, so cruel! To think Eugene, with his black eyes, his soft hair, his smiling face, could be so treacherous, so subtle, so dastardly! Could he really be as mean as this note proved him to be? Could he be as brutal, as selfish? Was she awake or asleep? Was this a dream? Oh God, no, no, it was not a dream. It was a cold, bitter, agonizing reality. And the cause of all her suffering was there in the bathroom now, shaving himself. For one moment she thought she would go in and strike him where he stood. She thought she could tear his heart out, cut him up, but then suddenly the picture of him bleeding and dead came to her and she recoiled. No, no, she could not do that. Oh no, not Eugene. And yet, oh God, let me get my hands on that woman, she said to herself. Let me get my hands on her. I'll kill her. I'll kill her. I'll kill her. This torrent of fury and self-pity was still raging in her heart when the bathroom knob clicked and Eugene came out. He was in his undershirt, trousers, and shoes, looking for a clean white shirt. He was very nervous over the note, which had been thrown in scraps into the box. But looking in the kitchen and seeing the pieces still there, he was slightly reassured. Angela was not there. He could come back and get them when he found out where she was. He went into the bedroom, looking into the front room as he did so. She appeared to be at the window waiting for him. After all, she was probably not as suspicious as he thought. It was his own imagination. He was too nervous and sensitive. Well, he would get those pieces now, if he could, and throw them out of the window. Angela should not have a chance to examine them if she wanted to. He slipped out into the kitchen, made a quick grab for the little heap, and sent the pieces flying. Then he felt much better. He would never bring another letter home from anybody, that was a certainty. Fate was too much against him. Angela came out after a bit, for the click of the bathroom knob had sobered her a little. Her rage was high, her pulse abnormal, her whole being shaken to its roots, but still she realized that she must have time to think. She must see who this woman was first. She must have time to find her. Eugene mustn't know. Where was she now? Where was this bridge? Where did they meet? Where did she live? She wondered for the moment why she couldn't think it all out. Why it didn't come to her in a flash, a revelation. If she could only know. In a few minutes Eugene came in, clean shaven, smiling, his equanimity and peace of mind fairly well restored. The letter was gone. Angela could never know. She might suspect, but this possible burst of jealousy had been nipped in the bud. He came over toward her to put his arm around her, but she slipped away from him, pretending to need the sugar. He let this effort of love-making go, the will for the deed, and sat down at the snow-white little table set with tempting dishes and waited to be served. The day had been very pleasant, being early in October, and he was pleased to see a last lingering ray of light falling on some red and yellow leaves. This yard was very beautiful. This little flat, for all their poverty, very charming. Angela was neat and trim in a dainty house dress of mingled brown and green. A dark blue studio apron shielded her bosom and skirt. She was very pale and distraught looking, but Eugene for the time was almost unconscious of it. He was so relieved. "Are you very tired, Angela?" he finally asked sympathetically. "Yes, I'm not feeling so well today," she replied. "What have you been doing? Ironing?" "Oh, yes, and cleaning. I worked on the cupboard." "You oughtn't to try to do so much," he said cheerfully. "You're not strong enough. You think you're a little horse, but you are only a colt. Better go slow, hadn't you?" "I will after I get everything straightened out to suit me," she replied. She was having the struggle of her life to conceal her real feelings. Never at any time had she undergone such an ordeal as this. Once in the studio, when she discovered those two letters, she thought she was suffering, but what was that to this? What were her suspicions concerning Frieda? What were the lonely longings at home, her grieving and worrying over his illness? Nothing, nothing. Now he was actually faithless to her. Now she had the evidence. This woman was here. She was somewhere in the immediate background. After these years of marriage and close companionship, he was deceiving her. It was possible that he had been with this woman today, yesterday, the day before. The letter was not dated. Could it be that she was related to Mrs. Hibberdell? Eugene had said there was a married daughter, but never that she was there. If she was there, why should he have moved? He wouldn't have. Was it the wife of the man he was last living with? No, she was too homely. Angela had seen her. Eugene would never associate with her. If she could only know. Ashes of roses. The world went red before her eyes. There was no use bursting into a storm now, though if she could only be calm it would be better. If she only had someone to talk to, if there were a minister or a bosom friend. She might go to a detective agency. They might help her. A detective could trace this woman and Eugene. Did she want to do this? It cost money. They were very poor now. Pah! Why should she worry about their poverty? Mending her dresses, going without hats, going without decent shoes, and he wasting his time and being upon some shameless strumpet. If he had money, he would spend it on her. Still, he had handed her almost all the money he had brought East with him intact. How was that? All the time Eugene was sitting opposite her, eating with fair heartiness. If the trouble about the letter had not come out so favorably, he would have been without appetite. But now he felt at ease. Angela said she was not hungry and could not eat. She passed him the bread, the butter, the hashed brown potatoes, the tea, and he ate cheerfully. "I think I'm going to try and get out of that shop over there," he volunteered affably. "Why?" asked Angela mechanically. "I'm tired of it. The men are not so interesting to me now. I'm tired of them. I think Mr. Haverford will transfer me if I write to him. He said he would. I'd rather be outside with some section gang if I could. It's going to be very dreary in the shop when they close it up." "Well, if you're tired, you'd better," replied Angela. "Your mind needs diversion. I know that. Why don't you write to Mr. Haverford?" "I will," he said, but he did not immediately. He went into the front room and lit the gas eventually, reading a paper, then a book, then yawning wearily. Angela came in after a time and sat down pale and tired. She went and secured a little work basket in which were socks undarned and other odds and ends and began on those, but she revolted at the thought of doing anything for him and put them up. She got out a skirt of hers which she was making. Eugene watched her a little while lazily, his artistic eye measuring the various dimensions of her features. She had a well-balanced face, he finally concluded. He noted the effect of the light on her hair, the peculiar hue it gave it, and wondered if he could get that in oil. Night scenes were harder than those of full daylight. Shadows were so very treacherous. He got up finally. "Well, I'm going to turn in," he said. "I'm tired. I have to get up at 6. Oh dear, this darn day labor business gives me a pain. I wish it were over." Angela did not trust herself to speak. She was so full of pain and despair that she thought if she spoke she would cry. He went out, saying, "Coming soon?" She nodded her head. When he was gone the storm burst and she broke into a blinding flood of tears. They were not only tears of sorrow but of rage and helplessness. She went out on the little balcony which was there and cried alone, the night lights shining wistfully about. After the first storm she began to harden and dry up again, for helpless tears were foreign to her in a rage. She dried her eyes and became white-faced and desperate as before. The dog, the scoundrel, the brute, the hound, she thought. How could she have ever loved him? How could she love him now? Oh, the horror of life, its injustice, its cruelty, its shame! That she should be dragged through the mire with a man like this. The pity of it, the shame! If this was art, death take it! And yet hate him as she might, hate this hellish man-trap who signed herself Ashes of Roses. She loved him too. She could not help it. She knew she loved him. Oh, to be crossed by two fevers like this! Why might she not die? Why not die right now? End of section 56. Section 57 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 28. The hells of love are bitter and complete. There were days after that when she watched him, followed him down the pleasant lane from the house to the water's edge, slipping out unceremoniously after he had gone not more than 800 feet. She watched the bridge at Riverwood at 1 and 6, expecting that Eugene and his paramour might meet there. It just happened that Carlotta was compelled to leave town for 10 days with her husband, and so Eugene was safe. On 2 occasions he went downtown, into the heart of the great city, anxious to get a breath of the old life that so fascinated him. And Angela followed him, only to lose track of him quickly. He did nothing evil, however, merely walked, wondering what Miriam Finch and Christina Channing and Norma Whitmore were doing these days, and what they were thinking of him in his long absence. Of all the people he had known, he had only seen Norma Whitmore once, and that was not long after he returned to New York. He had given her a garbled explanation of his illness, stated that he was going to work now, and proposed to come and see her. He did his best to avoid observation, however, for he dreaded explaining the reason for his non-productive condition. Miriam Finch was almost glad that he had failed, since he had treated her so badly. Christina Channing was in opera, as he quickly discovered, for he saw her name blazoned one day the following November in the newspapers. She was a star whose talent great hopes were entertained, and was interested almost exclusively in her career. She was to sing in Bohème and Rigoletto. Another thing fortunate for Eugene at this time was that he changed his work. There came to the shop one day an Irish foreman, Timothy Deegan, master of a score of guineas, as he called the Italian day laborers who worked for him, who took Eugene's fancy greatly. He was of medium height, thick of body and neck, with a cheerful, healthy red face, a keen, twinkling gray eye, and stiff, closely cropped gray hair and mustache. He had come to lay the foundation for a small dynamo in the engine room at Speonk, which was to supply the plant with light in case of night work. And a car of his had been backed in, a tool car, full of boards, barrows, mortar boards, picks, and shovels. Eugene was amused and astonished at his insistent, defiant attitude and the brisk manner in which he was handing out orders to his men. "Come, Matt, come, Jimmy. Get the shovels now. Get the picks," he heard him shout. "Bring some sand here. Bring some stone. Where's the cement now? Where's the cement? Jesus Christ, I must have some cement. What are you all doing? Hurry now, hurry. Bring the cement." "Well, he knows how to give orders," commented Eugene to Big John, who was standing near. "He certainly does," replied the latter. To himself Eugene observed, hearing only the calls at first, "the Irish brute." Later he discovered a subtle twinkling in Deegan's eyes as he stood brazenly in the door looking defiantly about. There was no brutality in it, only self-confidence and a hearty Irish insistence on the necessity of the hour. "Well, you're a dandy," commented Eugene boldly after a time, and laughed. "Ha ha," marked Deegan in return. "If you had to work as hard as these men you wouldn't laugh." "I'm not laughing at them. I'm laughing at you," explained Eugene. "Laugh?" said Deegan. "Sure you're as funny to me as I am to you." Eugene laughed again. The Irishman agreed with himself that there was humor in it. He laughed too. Eugene patted his big rough shoulder with his hands, and they were friends immediately. It did not take Deegan long to find out from Big John why he was there and what he was doing. "An artist," he commented. "Sure he'd better be outside than in. The looks of him packing shavings and him laughing at me." Big John smiled. "I believe he wants to get outside," he said. "Why don't he come with me then? He'd have a fine time working with the guineas. Sure that would make a man of him. A few months of that." He pointed to Angelo Esposito shoveling clay. Big John thought this worth reporting to Eugene. He did not think that he wanted to work with the guineas, but he might like to be with Deegan. Eugene saw his opportunity. He liked Deegan. "Would you like to have an artist who's looking for health come and work for you, Deegan?" Eugene asked genially. He thought Deegan might refuse, but it didn't matter. It was worth the trial. "Sure," replied the latter. "Will I have to work with the Italians?" "There'd be plenty of work for you to do without laying your hand to pick or shovel unless you want to. Sure, that's no work for white men to do." "And what do you call them, Deegan? Aren't they white?" "Sure they're not." "What are they then? They're not black." "Negroes, of course." "But they're not negroes." "Well, begad, they're not white. Any man can tell that by looking at 'em." Eugene smiled. He understood at once the solid Irish temperament which could draw this hearty conclusion. There was no malice in it. Deegan did not underestimate these Italians. He liked his men, but they weren't white. He didn't know what they were exactly, but they weren't white. He was standing over them a moment later shouting, "Up with it! Up with it! Down with it! Down with it!" as though his whole soul were intent on driving the last scrap of strength out of these poor underlings, when, as a matter of fact, they were not working very hard at all. His glance was roving about in a general way as he yelled, and they paid little attention to him. Once in a while he would interpolate, "Come, Matt," in a softer key, a key so soft that it was entirely out of keeping with his other voice. Eugene saw it all clearly. He understood Deegan. "I think I'll get Mr. Haverford to transfer me to you if you'll let me come," he said at the close of the day, when Deegan was taking off his overalls and the Italians, as he called them, were putting things back in the car. "Sure," said Deegan, impressed by the great name of Haverford. If Eugene could accomplish that through such a far-off, wondrous personality, he must be a remarkable man himself. "Come along. I'll be glad to have you. You can just make out the O and K blanks and the reports and watch over the men such times as I'll not be there, and well, all told, you'll have enough to keep you busy." Eugene smiled. This was a pleasant prospect. Big John had told him during the morning that Deegan went up and down the road from Peekskill on the main line, Chatham on the Midland Division, and Mount Kisco on the third branch to New York City. He built wells, culverts, coal bins, building piers, small brick buildings, anything and everything in short which a capable foreman mason ought to be able to build, and in addition he was fairly content and happy in his task. Eugene could see it. The atmosphere of the man was wholesome. He was like a tonic, a revivifying dynamo to this sickly, overwrought sentimentalist. That night he went home to Angela, full of the humor and romance of his new situation. He liked the idea of it. He wanted to tell her about Deegan, to make her laugh. He was destined, unfortunately, to another kind of reception. For Angela by this time had endured the agony of her discovery to the breaking point. She had listened to his pretenses, knowing them to be lies, until she could endure it no longer. In following him she had discovered nothing, and the change in his work would make the chase more difficult. It was scarcely possible for anyone to follow him, for he himself did not know where he would be from day to day. He would be here, there, and everywhere. His sense of security, as well as his unfairness, made him sensitive about being nice in the unimportant things. When he thought at all, he was ashamed of what he was doing, thoroughly ashamed. Like the drunkard, he appeared to be mastered by his weakness, and the psychology of his attitude is so best interpreted. He caressed her sympathetically, for he thought from her drawn, weary look that she was verging on some illness. She appeared to him to be suffering from worry for him, overwork, or approaching malady. But Eugene, in spite of his unfaithfulness, did sympathize with Angela greatly. He appreciated her good qualities, her truthfulness, economy, devotion, and self-sacrifice in all things which related to him. He was sorry that his own yearning for freedom crossed with her desire for simple-minded devotion on his part. He could not love her as she wanted him to, that he knew, and yet he was at times sorry for it, very. He would look at her when she was not looking at him, admiring her industry, her patience, her pretty figure, her geniality in the face of many difficulties, and wish that she could have a better fate than to have met and married him. Because of these feelings on his part for her, he could not bear to see her suffer. When she appeared to be ill, he could not help drawing near to her, wanting to know how she was, endeavoring to make her feel better by those sympathetic, emotional demonstrations which he knew meant so much to her. On this particular evening, noting the still drawn agony of her face, he was moved to insist, "What's the matter with you, Angel Face, these days? You look so tired. You're not right. What's troubling you?" "Oh, nothing," replied Angela wearily. "But I know there is," he replied. "You can't be feeling well. What's ailing you? You're not like yourself at all. Won't you tell me, sweet? What's the trouble?" He was thinking, because Angela said nothing, that it must be a real physical illness. Any emotional complaint vented itself quickly. "Why should you care?" she asked cautiously, breaking her self-imposed vow of silence. She was thinking that Eugene and this woman, whoever she was, were conspiring to defeat her, and that they were succeeding. Her voice had changed from one of weary resignation to subtle, semi-concealed complaint and offense, and Eugene noticed it. Before she could add any more, he had observed, "Why shouldn't I?" "Why, how you talk! What's the matter now?" Angela really did not intend to go on. Her query was dragged out of her by his obvious sympathy. He was sorry for her in some general way. It made her pain and wrath all the greater. And his additional inquiry irritated her the more. "Why should you?" she asked weepingly. "You don't want me. You don't like me. You pretend sympathy when I look a little bad, but that's all. You don't care for me. If you could get rid of me, you would. That is so plain." "Why, what are you talking about?" he asked, astonished. Had she found out anything? Was the incident of the scraps of paper really closed? Had anybody been telling her anything about Carlotta? Instantly he was all at sea. Still he had to pretend. "You know I care," he said. "How can you say that?" "You don't. You know you don't," she flared up suddenly. "Why do you lie? You don't care. Don't touch me. Don't come near me. I'm sick of your hypocritical pretenses. Oh!" And she straightened up with her fingernails cutting into her palms. Eugene, at the first expression of disbelief on her part, had laid his hand soothingly on her arm. That was why she had jumped away from him. Now he drew back, nonplussed, nervous, a little defiant. It was easier to combat rage than sorrow, but he did not want to do either. "What's the matter with you?" he asked, assuming a look of bewildered innocence. "What have I done now?" "What haven't you done? You'd better ask. You dog, you coward," flared Angela. "Leaving me to stay out in Wisconsin while you go running around with a shameless woman. Don't deny it. Don't dare to deny it." This apropos of a protesting movement on the part of Eugene's head. "I know all. I know more than I want to know. I know how you've been acting. I know what you've been doing. I know how you've been lying to me. You've been running around with a low, vile wretch of a woman, while I have been staying out in Blackwood eating my heart out. That's what you've been doing. Dear Angela, dear angel face, dear Madonna Dolorosa. Ha! What have you been calling her, you lying, hypocritical coward? What names have you for her? Hypocrite, brute, liar. I know what you've been doing. Oh, how well I know. Why was I ever born? Oh, why? Her voice trailed off in a wail of agony. Eugene stood there astonished to the point of inefficiency. He could not think of a single thing to do or say. He had no idea upon what evidence she based her complaint. He fancied that it must be much more than had been contained in that little note which he had torn up. She had not seen that. Of that he was reasonably sure. Where was he? Could she have taken it out of the box while he was in the bath and then put it back again? This sounded like it. She had looked very bad that night. How much did she know? Where had she secured this information? Mrs. Hibberdell? Carlotta? No. Had she seen her? Where? When? "You're talking through your hat," he said aimlessly and largely in order to get time. "You're crazy. What's got into you anyhow? I haven't been doing anything of the sort." "Oh, haven't you?" she sneered. "You haven't been meeting her at bridges and roadhouses and street cars, have you? You liar! You haven't been calling her Ashes of Roses and River Nymph and Angel Girl?" Angela was making up names and places out of her own mind. "I suppose you used some of the pet names on her that you gave to Christina Channing, didn't you? She liked those, the vile strumpet. And you dog, pretending to me, pretending sympathy, pretending loneliness, pretending sorrow, that I couldn't be here. A lot you cared what I was doing or thinking or suffering. Oh, I hate you, you horrible coward. I hate her. I hope something terrible happens to you. If I could get at her now, I would kill her and you both, and myself. I would. I wish I could die. I wish I could die." Eugene was beginning to get the measure of this inquiry as Angela interpreted it. He could see now how cruelly he had hurt her. He could see now how vile what he was doing looked in her eyes. It was bad business, running with other women. No doubt of it. It always ended in something like this, a terrible storm in which he had to sit by and hear himself called brutal names to which there was no legitimate answer. He had heard of this in connection with other people, but he had never thought it would come to him. And the worst of it was that he was guilty and deserving of it. No doubt of that. It lowered him in his own estimation. It lowered her in his and her own because she had to fight this way. Why did he do it? Why did he drag her into such a situation? It was breaking down that sense of pride in himself which was the only sustaining power a man had before the gaze of the world. Why did he let himself into these situations? Did he really love Carlotta? Did he want pleasure enough to endure such abuse as this? This was a terrible scene. And where would it end? His nerves were tingling, his brain fairly aching. If he could only conquer this desire for another type and be faithful, and yet how dreadful that seemed. To confine himself in all his thoughts to just Angela, it was not possible. He thought of these things standing there, enduring the brunt of this storm. It was a terrible ordeal, but it was not wholly reformatory even at that. "What's the use of carrying on like that, Angela?" he said, grimly, after he had listened to all this. "It isn't as bad as you think. I'm not a liar and I'm not a dog. You must have pieced that note I threw in the paper box together and read it. When did you do it?" He was curious about that and about how much she knew. What were her intentions in regard to him? What in regard to Carlotta? What would she do next? "When did I do it?" she replied. "When did I do it? What does that have to do with it? What right have you to ask? Where is this woman? That's what I want to know. I want to find her. I want to face her. I want to tell her what a wretched beast she is. I'll show her how to come and steal another woman's husband. I'll kill her. I'll kill her and I'll kill you too. Do you hear? I'll kill you." And she advanced on him defiantly, blazingly. Eugene was astounded. He had never seen such rage in any woman. It was wonderful, fascinating, something like a great lightning-riven storm. Angela was capable of hurling thunderbolts of wrath. He had not known that. It raised her in his estimation, made her really more attractive than she would otherwise have been, for power, however displayed, is fascinating. She was so little, so grim, so determined. It was in its way a test of great capability, and he liked her for it, even though he resented her abuse. "No, no, Angela," he said sympathetically, and with a keen wish to alleviate her sorrow. "You would not do anything like that. You couldn't." I will," she declared. "I'll kill her and you too." And then, having reached this tremendous height, she suddenly broke. Eugene's big, sympathetic understanding was after all too much for her. His brooding patience in the midst of her wrath, his innate sorrow for what he could not or would not help, it was written all over his face. His very obvious presentation of the fact by his attitude that he knew that she loved him in spite of this, was too much for her. It was like beating her hands against a stone. She might kill him and this woman, whoever she was, but she would not have changed his attitude toward her, and that was what she wanted. A great torrent of heartbreaking sobs broke from her, shaking her frame like a reed. She threw her arms and head upon the kitchen table, fallen to her knees, and cried and cried. Eugene stood there contemplating the wreck he had made of her dreams. Certainly it was hell, he said to himself. Certainly it was. He was a liar, as she said, a dog, a scoundrel. Poor little Angela. Well, the damage had been done. What could he do now? Anything? Certainly not. Not a thing. She was broken, heartbroken. There was no earthly remedy for that. Priests might strive for broken laws, but for a broken heart, what remedy was there? "Angela," he called gently. "Angela, I'm sorry. Don't cry, Angela. Don't cry." But she did not hear him. She did not hear anything. Lost in the agony of her situation, she could only sob convulsively until it seemed that her pretty little frame would break to pieces. End of section 57.
Section 58 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 29. Eugene's feelings on this occasion were of a reasonable duration. It is always possible under such circumstances to take the victim
of our brutalities in our arms and utter a few sympathetic or repentant words. The real kindness and repentance which consists in reformation is quite another matter. One must see with eyes too pure to behold evil to do that. Eugene was not to be reformed by an hour or many hours of agony on any one's part. Angela was well within the range of his sympathetic interests. He suffered with her keenly, but not enough to outrun or offset his own keen desire for what he considered his spiritual right to enjoy beauty. What harm did it do, he would have asked himself, if he secretly exchanged affectionate looks and feelings with Carlotta or any other woman who fascinated him and in turn was fascinated by him? Could an affinity of this character really be called evil? He was not giving her any money, which Angela ought to have had, or very little. He did not want to marry her, and she really did not want to marry him, he thought. There was no chance of that anyhow. He wanted to associate with her, and what harm did that do Angela? None, if she did not know. Of course, if she knew, it was very sad for her and for him. But if the shoe were on the other foot, and Angela was the one who was acting as he was acting now, he would not care, he thought. He forgot to add that if he did not care, it would be because he was not in love, and Angela was in love. Such reasoning runs in circles. Only it is not reasoning. It is sentimental and emotional anarchy. There is no will toward progress in it. When Angela recovered from her first burst of rage and grief, it was only to continue it further, though not quite in the same vein. There can only be one superlative in any field of endeavor. Beyond that may be mutterings and thunderings, or a shining afterglow, but no second superlative. Angela charged him with every weakness and evil tendency, only to have him look at her in a solemn way, occasionally saying, "Oh no, you know I'm not as bad as that," or "Why do you abuse me in that way? That isn't true," or "Why do you say that?" "Because it is so, and you know it's so," Angela would declare. "Listen, Angela," he replied once, with a certain amount of logic. "There is no use in browbeating me in this way. It doesn't do any good to call me names. You want me to love you, don't you? That's all you want. You don't want anything else. Will calling me names make me do it? If I can't, I can't. And if I can, I can. How will fighting help that?" She listened to him pitifully, for she knew that her rage was useless, or practically so. He was in the position of power. She loved him. That was the sad part of it. To think that tears and pleadings and wrath might not really avail after all. He could only love her out of a desire that was not self-generated. That was something she was beginning to see in a dim way as a grim truth. Once she folded her hands and sat white and drawn, staring at the floor. "Well, I don't know what to do," she declared. "I suppose I ought to leave you. If it just weren't for my family. They all think so highly of the marriage state. They are so naturally faithful and decent. I suppose these qualities have to be born in people. They can't be acquired. You would have to be made over." Eugene knew she would not leave him. He smiled at the superior condescension of the last remark, though it was not intended as such by her. To think of his being made over after the model Angela and her relatives would lay down. "I don't know where I'd go or what I'd do," she observed. "I can't go back to my family. I don't want to go there. I haven't been trained in anything except school teaching, and I hate to think of that again. If I could only study stenography or bookkeeping." She was talking as much to clear her own mind as his. She really did not know what to do. Eugene listened to the self-demonstrated situation with a shammed face. It was hard for him to think of Angela being thrown out on the world as a bookkeeper or a stenographer. He did not want to see her doing anything like that. In a way, he wanted to live with her, if it could be done in his way, much as the Mormons might, perhaps. What a lonely life hers would be if she were away from him, and she was not suited to it. She was not suited to the commercial world. She was too homely, too housewifely. He wished he could assure her now that she would not have further cause for grief, and mean it. But he was like a sick man, wishing he could do the things a hale man might. There was no self-conviction in his thoughts, only the idea that if he tried to do right in this matter, he might succeed, but he would be unhappy. So he drifted. In the meanwhile, Eugene had taken up his work with Deegan and was going through a very curious experience. At the time Deegan had stated that he would take him, he had written to Haverford, making a polite request for transfer, and was immediately informed that his wishes would be granted. Haverford remembered Eugene kindly. He hoped he was improving. He understood from inquiry of the superintendent of buildings that Deegan was in need of a capable assistant, anyhow, and that Eugene could well serve in that capacity. The foreman was always in trouble about his reports. An order was issued to Deegan commanding him to receive Eugene, and another to Eugene from the office of the superintendent of buildings, ordering him to report to Deegan. Eugene went, finding him working on the problem of constructing a coal bin under the depot at Ford's Center, and raising as much a storm as ever. He was received with a grin of satisfaction. "So here you are. Well, you're just in time. I want you to go down to the office." Eugene laughed. "Sure," he said. Deegan was down in a freshly excavated hole, and his clothes were redolent of the freshly turned earth which surrounded him. He had a plumb bob in his hand and a spirit level, but he laid them down. Under the neat train shed to which he crawled when Eugene appeared, and where they stood, he fished from a pocket of his old gray coat a soiled and crumpled letter, which he carefully unfolded with his thick and clumsy fingers. Then he held it up and looked at it defiantly. "I want you to go to Woodlawn," he continued, "and look after some bolts that are there. There's a keg of 'em, and sign the bill for 'em and ship them down to me. They're not many. And then I want you to go down to the office and take them this O.K." And here he fished around and produced another crumpled slip. "It's nonsense," he exclaimed when he saw it. "It's unreasonable. They're always yelling for them O.K. blanks. You think, begod, I was going to steal from them. You think I lived on the things. O.K. blanks, O.K. blanks, from morning till night, O.K. blanks. It's nonsense. It's unreasonable." And his face flushed a defiant red. Eugene could see that some infraction of the railroad's rules had occurred, and that Deacon had been called down or jacked up about it, as the railroad men expressed it. He was in a high state of dudgeon, as defiant and pugnacious as his Royal Irish temper would allow. "I'll fix it," said Eugene. "That's all right. Leave it to me." Deegan showed some signs of approaching relief. At last he had a man of intelligence, as he would have expressed it. He flung a parting shot, though, at his superior as Eugene departed. "Tell him I'll sign for them when I get them and not before," he rumbled. Eugene laughed. He knew no such message would be accepted, but he was glad to give Deegan an opportunity to blow off steam. He entered upon his new tasks with vim, pleased with the out of doors, the sunshine, the opportunity for brief trips up and down the road like this. It was delightful. He would soon be all right now, that he knew. He went to Woodlawn and signed for the bolts, went to the office and met the chief clerk, delivering the desired O.K. blanks in person, who informed him of the chief difficulty in Deegan's life. It appeared that there were some 25 of these reports to be made out monthly, to say nothing of endless O.K. blanks to be filled in with acknowledgment of material received. Everything had to be signed for in this way. It mattered not whether it was a section of a bridge or a single bolt or a pound of putty. If a man could sit down and reel off a graphic report of what he was doing, he was the pride of the chief clerk's heart. His doing the work properly was taken as a matter of course. Deegan was not efficient at this, though he was assisted at times by his wife and all 3 of his children, a boy and 2 girls. He was constantly in hot water. "My God!" exclaimed the chief clerk, when Eugene explained that Deegan had thought that he might leave the bolts at the station where they would be safe until he needed them, and then sign for them when he took them out. He ran his hands distractedly through his hair. "What do you think of that?" he exclaimed. "He'll leave them there until he needs them, will he? What becomes of my reports? I've got to have those O.K.s. You tell Deegan he ought to know better than that. He's been long enough on the road. You tell him that I said that I want a signed form for everything consigned to him the moment he learns that it's waiting for him. And I want it without fail. Let him go and get it. The gall! He's got to come to time about this, or something's going to drop. I'm not going to stand for it any longer. You'd better help him in this. I've got to make out my reports on time." Eugene agreed that he would. This was his field. He could help Deegan. He could be really useful. Time passed. The weather grew colder, and while the work was interesting at first, like all other things, it began after a time to grow monotonous. It was nice enough, when the weather was fine, to stand out under the trees where some culvert was being built, to bridge a small rivulet, or some well to supply the freight engines with water, and survey the surrounding landscape. But when the weather grew colder, it was not so nice. Deegan was always interesting. He was forever raising a ruction. He lived a life of hard, narrow activity laid among boards, wheelbarrows, cement, stone, a life which concerned construction and had no particular joy in fruition. The moment a thing was nicely finished, they had to leave it and go where everything would be torn up again. Eugene used to look at the wounded ground, the piles of yellow mud, the dirty Italians, clean enough in their spirit, but soiled and gnarled by their labor, and wonder how much longer he could stand it. To think that he, of all men, should be here working with Deegan and the guineas. He became lonesome at times, terribly, and sad. He longed for Carlotta, longed for a beautiful studio, longed for a luxurious, artistic life. It seemed that life had wronged him terribly, and yet he could do nothing about it. He had no money-making capacity. About this time the construction of a rather pretentious machine shop, 200 by 200 feet and some 4 stories high, was assigned to Deegan, largely because of the efficiency which Eugene contributed to Deegan's work. Eugene handled his reports and accounts with rapidity and precision, and this so soothed the division management that they had an opportunity to see Deegan's real worth. The latter was beside himself with excitement, anticipating great credit and distinction for the work he was now to be permitted to do. "'Tis a fine time we'll have, Eugene, my boy," he exclaimed, "putting up that building. 'Tis no culvert we'll be after building now, no coal bin. Wait till the masons come, then you'll see something." Eugene was pleased that their work was progressing so successfully, but of course there was no future in it for him. He was lonely and disheartened. Besides, Angela was complaining, and rightfully enough, that they were leading a difficult life. And to what end, so far as she was concerned? He might recover his health and his art. By reason of his dramatic shake-up and changes he appeared to be doing so. But what would that avail her? He did not love her. If he became prosperous again, it might be to forsake her. And at best he could only give her money and position, if he ever attained these. And how would that help? It was love that she wanted, his love, and she did not have that, or only a mere shadow of it. He had made up his mind after this last fatal argument that he would not pretend to anything he did not feel in regard to her, and this made it even harder. She did believe that he sympathized with her in his way, but it was an intellectual sympathy and had very little to do with the heart. He was sorry for her. Sorry? Sorry? How she hated the thought of that. If he could not do any better than that, what was there in all the years to come but misery? A curious fact to be noted about this period was that suspicion had so keyed up Angela's perceptions that she could almost tell, and that without knowing, when Eugene was with Carlotta or had been. There was something about his manner when he came in of an evening, to say nothing of those subtler thought waves which passed from him to her when he was with Carlotta, which told her instantly where he had been and what he had been doing. She would ask him where he had been, and he would say, "Oh, up the White Plains," or "out to Scarborough." But nearly always when he had been with Carlotta, she would flare up with, "Yes, I know where you've been. You've been out again with that miserable beast of a woman. Oh, God will punish her yet. You will be punished. Wait and see." Tears would flood her eyes, and she would berate him roundly. Eugene stood in profound awe before these subtle outbreaks. He could not understand how it was that Angela came to know or suspect so accurately. To a certain extent he was a believer in spiritualism and the mysteries of a subconscious mind or self. He fancied that there must be some way of this self-conscious self seeing or apprehending what was going on and of communicating its knowledge in the form of fear and suspicion to Angela's mind. If the very subtleties of nature were in league against him, how was he to continue or profit in his career? Obviously, it could not be done. He would probably be severely punished for it. He was half terrified by the vague suspicion that there might be some laws which tended to correct in this way all the abuses in nature. There might be much vice and crime going seemingly unpunished, but there might also be much correction going on, as the suicides and deaths and cases of insanity seemed to attest. Was this true? Was there no escape from the result of evil except by abandoning it entirely? He pondered over this gravely. Getting on his feet again financially was not such an easy thing. He had been out of touch now for so long with things artistic, the magazine world, and the art agencies, that he felt as if he might not readily be able to get in touch again. Besides, he was not at all sure of himself. He had made sketches of men and things at Spionk, and of Deegan and his gang on the road, and of Carlotta and Angela, but he felt that they were weak in their import, lacking in the force and feeling which had once characterized his work. He thought of trying his hand at newspaper work, if he could make any sort of connection, working in some obscure newspaper art department until he should feel himself able to do better, but he did not feel at all confident that he could get that. His severe breakdown had made him afraid of life, made him yearn for the sympathy of a woman like Carlotta, or of a larger, more hopeful, more tender attitude, and he dreaded looking for anything anywhere. Besides, he hated to spare the time unless he were going to get somewhere. His work was so pressing, but he knew that he must quit it. He thought about it wearily, wishing he were better placed in the world, and finally screwed up his courage to leave this work, though it was not until something else was quite safely in his hands. End of section 58. Section 59 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 30. It was only after a considerable lapse of time, when trying to live on $9 a week, and seeing Angela struggle almost hopelessly in her determination to live on what he earned and put a little aside, that he came to his senses and made a sincere effort to find something better. During all this time he had been watching her narrowly, seeing how systematically she did all her housework, even under these adverse and trying circumstances, cooking, cleaning, marketing. She made over her old clothes, reshaping them so that they would last longer and still look stylish. She made her own hats, doing everything in short that she could to make the money in the bank hold out until Eugene should be on his feet. She was willing that he should take money and buy himself clothes when she was not willing to spend it on herself. She was living in the hope that somehow he would reform. Consciousness of what she was worth to him might some day strike him. Still she did not feel that things could ever be quite the same again. She could never forget, and neither could he. The affair between Eugene and Carlotta, because of the various forces that were mitigating against it, was now slowly drawing to a close. It had not been able to endure all the storm and distress which followed its discovery. For one thing, Carlotta's mother, without telling her husband, made him feel that he had good cause to stay about, which made it difficult for Carlotta to act. Besides, she charged her daughter constantly, much as Angela was charging Eugene, with the utmost dissoluteness of character, and was as constantly putting her on the defensive. She was too hedged about to risk a separate apartment, and Eugene would not accept money from her to pay for expensive indoor entertainment. She wanted to see him, but she kept hoping he would get to the point where he would have a studio again, and she could see him as a star in his own field. That would be so much nicer. By degrees their once exciting engagements began to lapse, and despite his grief, Eugene was not altogether sorry. To tell the truth, great physical discomfort recently had painted his romantic tendencies in a very sorry light for him. He thought he saw in a way where they were leading him. That there was no money in them was obvious. That the affairs of the world were put in the hands of those who were content to get their life's happiness out of their management seemed quite plain. Idlers had nothing as a rule, not even the respect of their fellow men. The licentious were worn threadbare and disgraced by their ridiculous and psychologically diseased propensities. Women and men who indulged in these unbridled relations were sickly sentimentalists as a rule, and were thrown out or ignored by all forceful society. One had to be strong, eager, determined, and abstemious if wealth was to come, and then it had to be held by the same qualities. One could not relax, otherwise one became much what he was now, a brooding sentimentalist, diseased in mind and body. So out of love excitement and poverty and ill health and abuse, he was coming to see, or thought he was, this one fact clearly, namely, that he must behave himself if he truly wished to succeed. Did he want to? He could not say that, but he had to. That was the sad part of it. And since apparently he had to, he would do the best he could. It was grim, but it was essential. At this time Eugene still retained the rather ultra-artistic appearance which had characterized his earlier years, but he began to suspect that on this score he was a little bizarre and out of keeping with the spirit of the times. Certain artists whom he met in times past and recently were quite commercial in their appearance, the very successful ones, and he decided that it was because they put the emphasis on the hard facts of life and not upon the romance connected with their work. It impressed him, and he decided to do likewise, abandoning the flowing tie and the rather indiscriminate manner he had of combing his hair, and thereafter affected severe simplicity. He still wore a soft hat because he thought it became him best, but otherwise he toned himself down greatly. His work with Deegan had given him a sharp impression of what hard, earnest labor meant. Deegan was nothing but a worker. There was no romance in him. He knew nothing about romance. Picks and shovels and mortar boards and concrete forms, such was his life, and he never complained. Eugene remembered commiserating him once on having to get up at 4 a.m. in order to take a train which would get to work by 7. Darkness and cold made no difference to him, however. "Sure I have to be there," he had replied, with his quizzical Irish grin. "They're not paying me wages for lying in bed. If you were to get up that way every day for a year, it would make a man of you." "Oh, no," said Eugene teasingly. "Oh, yes," said Deegan, "it would. And you're the one that's needing it. I can tell that by the cut of you." Eugene resented this, but it stayed by him. Deegan had a habit of driving home salutary lessons in regard to work and abstemiousness without really meaning to. The two were wholly representative of him, just those two things and nothing more. One day he went down into Printing House Square to see if he could not make up his mind to apply at one of the newspaper art departments, when he ran into Hudson Dula, who he had not seen for a long while. The latter was delighted to see him. "Why, hello, Witla," he exclaimed, shocked to see that he was exceptionally thin and pale. Where have you been all these years? I'm delighted to see you. What have you been doing? Let's go over here to Hans, and you tell me all about yourself." "I've been sick, Dula," said Eugene frankly. "I had a severe case of nervous breakdown, and I've been working on the railroad for a change. I tried all sorts of specialists, but they couldn't help me. So I decided to go to work by the day and see what that would do. I got all out of sorts with myself, and I've been pretty near 4 years getting back. I think I'm getting better, though. I'm going to knock off on the road one of these days and try my hand at painting again. I think I can do it." "Isn't that curious?" replied Dula reminiscently. "I was just thinking of you the other day and wondering where you were. You know, I've quit the art director game. Truth failed, and I went into the lithographic business. I have a small interest in a plant that I'm managing down in Bond Street. I wish you'd come in and see me some day." "I certainly will," said Eugene. "Now this nervousness of yours," said Dula, as they strolled into the restaurant where they were dining. "I have a brother-in-law that was hit that way. He's still doctoring around. I'm going to tell him about your case. You don't look so bad." "I'm feeling much better," said Eugene. "I really am. But I've had a bad spell of it. I'm going to come back in the game, though. I feel sure of it. When I do, I'll know better how to take care of myself. I overworked on that first burst of pictures. "I must say that was the best stuff of that kind I ever saw done in this country," said Dula. "I saw both your shows, as you remember. They were splendid. What became of all those pictures?" "Oh, some were sold, and the rest are in storage," replied Eugene. "Curious, isn't it?" said Dula. "I should have thought all those things would have been purchased. They were so new and forceful in treatment. You want to pull yourself together and stay pulled. You're going to have a great future in that field." "Oh, I don't know," replied Eugene pessimistically. "It's all right to obtain a big reputation, but you can't live on that, you know. Pictures don't sell very well over here. I have most of mine left. A grocer with one delivery wagon has the best artist that ever lived backed right off the board for financial results." "Not quite as bad as that," said Dula smilingly. "An artist has something which a tradesman can never have, and you want to remember that. His point of view is worth something. He lives in a different world spiritually. And then financially you can do well enough. You can live, and what more do you want? You're received everywhere. You have what the tradesman cannot possibly obtain, distinction, and you give the world a standard of merit. You will at least. If I had your ability I would never sit about envying any butcher or baker. Why, all the artists know you now, the good ones anyhow. It only remains for you to do more, to obtain more. There are lots of things you can do." "What, for instance?" asked Eugene. "Why, ceilings, mural decorations. I was saying to someone the other day what a mistake it was that the Boston Library did not assign some of their panels to you. You would make splendid things of them." "You certainly have a world of faith in me," replied Eugene, tingling warmly. It was like a glowing fire to hear this after all the dreary days. Then the world still remembered him. He was worth while. "Do you remember Orrin Benedict? You used to know him out in Chicago, didn't you?" "I certainly did," replied Eugene. "I worked with him." "He's down on the World now, in charge of the art department there. He's just gone there." Then, as Eugene exclaimed over the curious shifts of time, he suddenly added, "Why, wouldn't that be a good idea for you? You say you're just about to knock off. Why don't you go down and do some pen work to get your hand in? It would be a good experience for you. Benedict would be glad to put you on, I'm sure." Dula suspected that Eugene might be out of funds, and this would be an easy way for him to slip into something which would lead back to studio work. He liked Eugene. He was anxious to see him get along. It flattered him to think he had been the first to publish his work in color. "That isn't a bad idea," said Eugene. "I was really thinking of doing something like that if I could. I'll go up and see him maybe today. It would be just the thing I need now, a little preliminary practice. I feel rather rusty and uncertain." "I'll call him up if you want," said Dula generously. "I know him well. He was asking me the other day if I knew one or two exceptional men. You wait here a minute." Eugene leaned back in his chair as Dula left. Could it be that he was going to be restored thus easily to something better? He had thought it would be so hard. Now this chance was coming to lift him out of his sufferings at the right time. Dula came back. "He says sure," he exclaimed. "Come right down. You'd better go down there this afternoon. That'll be just the thing for you. And when you are placed again, come around and see me. Where are you living?" Eugene gave him his address. "That's right. You're married," he added, when Eugene spoke of himself and Angela having a small place. "How is Mrs. Witla? I remember her as a very charming woman." "Mrs. Dula and I have an apartment in Gramercy Park. You didn't know I had tied up, did you? Well, I have. Bring your wife and come to see us. We'd be delighted. I'll make a dinner date for you two." Eugene was greatly pleased and elated. He knew Angela would be. They had seen nothing of artistic life lately. He hurried down to see Benedict and was greeted as an old acquaintance. They had never been very chummy, but always friendly. Benedict had heard of Eugene's nervous breakdown. "Well, I tell you," he said, after greeting and reminiscence were over, "I can't pay very much. $50 is high here just at present, and I have just one vacancy now at 25, which you can have if you want to try your hand. There's a good deal of hurry up about at times, but you don't mind that. When I get things straightened out here, I may have something better." "Oh, that's all right," replied Eugene cheerfully. "I'm glad to get that." He was very glad indeed. "And I don't mind the hurry. It will be good for a change." Benedict gave him a friendly handshake in farewell. He was glad to have him, for he knew what he could do. "I don't think I can come before Monday. I have to give a few days' notice. Is that all right?" "I could use you earlier, but Monday will do," said Benedict, and they parted genially. Eugene hurried back home. He was delighted to tell Angela, for this would rob their condition of part of its gloom. It was no great comfort to him to be starting in as a newspaper artist again at $25 a week, but it couldn't be helped, and it was better than nothing. At least it was putting him back on the track again. He was sure to do still better after this. He could hold this newspaper job, he felt, and outside that he didn't care very much for the time being. His pride had received some severe jolts. It was vastly better than day labor, anyway. He hurried up the 4 flights of stairs to the cheap little quarters they occupied, saying when he saw Angela at the gas range, "Well, I guess our railroad days are over." "What's the trouble?" asked Angela apprehensively. "No trouble," he replied. "I have a better job." "What is it?" "I'm going to be a newspaper artist for a while on the World." "When did you find that out?" she asked, brightening, for she had been terribly depressed over their state. "This afternoon. I'm going to work Monday. $25 will be some better than 9, won't it?" Angela smiled. "It certainly will," she said, and tears of thanksgiving filled her eyes. Eugene knew what those tears stood for. He was anxious to avoid painful reminiscences. "Don't cry," he said. "Things are going to be much better from now on." "Oh, I hope so. I hope so," she murmured, and he patted her head affectionately as it rested on his shoulder. "There now, cheer up, girlie, will you? We're going to be all right from now on." Angela smiled through her tears. She set the table exceedingly cheerful. "That is certainly good news," she laughed afterward. "But we're not going to spend any more money for a long while anyhow. We're going to save something. We don't want to get in this hole again." "No more for mine," replied Eugene gaily. "Not if I know my business," and he went into the one little combination parlor, sitting room and reception room and general room of all work to open his evening newspaper and whistle. In his excitement he almost forgot his woes over Carlotta and the love question in general. He was going to climb again in the world and be happy with Angela. He was going to be an artist or a business man or something. Look at Hudson Dula, owning a lithographic business and living in Gramercy Park. Could any artist he knew do that? Scarcely. He would see about this. He would think this art business over. Maybe he could be an art director or a lithographer or something. He had often thought while he was with the road that he could be a good superintendent of buildings if he could only give it time enough. Angela, for her part, was wondering what this change really spelled for her. Would he behave now? Would he set himself to the task of climbing slowly and surely? He was getting along in life. He ought to begin to place himself securely in the world if he ever was going to. Her love was not the same as it had formerly been. It was crossed with dislike and opposition at times, but still she felt that he needed her to help him. Poor Eugene! If only he were not cursed with this weakness. Perhaps he would overcome it. So she mused. End of section 59. Section 60 of The Genius by Theodore Dreiser. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 31. The work which Eugene undertook in connection with the art department of the World was not different from that which he had done 10 years before in Chicago. It seemed no less difficult for all his experience, more so, if anything, for he felt above it these days and consequently out of place. He wished at once that he could get something which would pay him commensurately with his ability. To sit down among mere boys, there were men there as old as himself and older, though of course he did not pay so much attention to them, was galling. He thought Benedict should have had more respect for his talent than to have offered him so little, though at the same time he was grateful for what he had received. He undertook energetically to carry out all the suggestions given him, and surprised his superior with the speed and imagination with which he developed everything. He surprised Benedict the second day with a splendid imaginative interpretation of the Black Death, which was to accompany a Sunday newspaper article on the modern possibilities of plagues. The latter saw at once that Eugene could probably be only retained a very little while at the figure he had given him. He had made the mistake of starting him low, thinking that Eugene's talent, after so severe an illness, might be at a very low ebb. He did not know, being new to the art directorship of a newspaper, how very difficult it was to get increases for those under him. An advance of $10 to anyone meant earnest representation and an argument with the business manager, and to double and treble the salary, which should have been done in this case, was out of the question. 6 months was a reasonable length of time for anyone to wait for an increase. Such was that dictate of the business management, and in Eugene's case it was ridiculous and unfair. However, being still sick and apprehensive, he was content to abide by the situation, hoping with returning strength and the saving of a little money to put himself right eventually. Angela, of course, was pleased with the turn of affairs. Having suffered so long with only prospects of something worse in store, it was a great relief to go to the bank every Tuesday. Eugene was paid on Monday and deposit $10 against a rainy day. It was agreed between them that they might use 6 for clothing, which Angela and Eugene very much needed, and some slight entertainment. It was not long before Eugene began to bring an occasional newspaper artist friend up to dinner, and they were invited out. They had gone without much clothing, with scarcely a single visit to the theater, without friends, everything. Now the tide began slowly to change. In a little while, because they were more free to go places, they began to encounter people whom they knew. There were 6 months of drifting journalistic work, in which, as in his railroad work, he grew more and more restless. And then there came a time when he felt as if he could not stand that for another minute. He had been raised to $35 and then $50, but it was a terrific grind of exaggerated and to him thoroughly meretricious art. The only valuable result in connection with it were that for the first time in his life he was drawing a moderately secure living salary, and that his mind was fully occupied with details which gave him no time to think about himself. He was in a large room surrounded by other men who were as sharp as knives in their thrusts of wit, and restless and greedy in their attitude toward the world. They wanted to live brilliantly, just as he did, only they had more self-confidence and in many cases that extreme poise which comes of rare good health. They were inclined to think he was somewhat of a poseur at first, but later they came to like him, all of them. He had a winning smile, and his love of a joke so keen, so body-shaking, drew to him all those who had a good story to tell. "Tell that to Witla" was a common phrase about the office, and Eugene was always listening to someone. He came to lunching with first one, and then another, and then three or four at a time, and by degrees Angela was compelled to entertain Eugene and two or three of his friends twice, and sometimes three times a week. She objected greatly, and there was some feeling over that, for she had no maid, and she did not think that Eugene ought to begin so soon to put the burden of entertainment upon her slender income. She wanted him to make these things very formal and by appointment. But Eugene would stroll in genially, explaining that he had Irving Nelson with him, or Henry Hare, or George Beers, and asking nervously at the last minute whether it was all right. Angela would say, "Certainly, to be sure," in front of the guests, but when they were alone there would be tears and reproaches and firm declarations that she would not stand it. "Well, I won't do it any more," Eugene would apologize. "I forgot, you know." Still he wanted Angela to get a maid and let him bring all who would come. It was a great relief to get back into the swing of things and see life broadening out once more. It was not so long after he had grown exceedingly weary of his underpaid relationship to the world that he heard of something which promised a much better avenue of advancement. Eugene had been hearing for some time from one source and another of the development of art in advertising. He had read one or two articles on the subject in the smaller magazines, had seen from time to time curious and sometimes beautiful series of ads run first by one corporation and then another, advertising some product. He had always fancied, in looking at these things, that he could get up a notable series on almost any subject, and he wondered who handled these things. He asked Benedict one night, going up on the car with him, what he knew about it. "Why, so far as I know," said Benedict, "that is coming to be quite a business. There is a man out in Chicago, Saligerian, an American Syrian, his father was a Syrian, but he was born over here, who has built up a tremendous business out of designing series of ads like that for big corporations. He got up that Molly Maguire series for the new cleaning fluid. I don't think he does any of the work himself. He hires artists to do it. Some of the best men, I understand, have done work for him. He gets splendid prices. Then some big advertising agencies are taking up that work. One of them I know, the Somerville Company, has a big art department in connection with it. They employ 15 to 18 men all the time, sometimes more. They turn out some fine ads too, to my way of thinking. Do you remember that Corno series?" Benedict was referring to a breakfast food which had been advertised by a succession of 10 very beautiful and very clever pictures. "Yes," replied Eugene. "Well, they did that." Eugene thought of this as a most interesting development. Since the days in which he had worked on the Alexandria appeal, he had been interested in ads. The thought of an ad creation took his fancy. It was newer than anything else he had encountered recently. He wondered if there would not be some chance in that field for him. His paintings were not selling. He had not the courage to start a new series. If he could make some money first, say $10,000, so that he could get an interest income of say $600 or $700 a year, he might be willing to risk art for art's sake. He had suffered too much. Poverty had scared him so that he was very anxious to lean on a salary or a business income for the time being. It was while he was speculating over this almost daily that there came to him one day a young artist who had formerly worked on the World, a youth by the name of Morgenbau, Adolph Morgenbau, who admired Eugene and his work greatly, and who had since gone to another paper. He was very anxious to tell Eugene something, for he had heard of a change coming in the art directorship of the Somerville Company, and he fancied for one reason and another that Eugene might be glad to know of it. Eugene had never looked to Morgenbau like a man who ought to be working in a newspaper art department. He was too self-poised, too superior, too wise. Morgenbau had conceived the idea that Eugene was destined to make a great hit of some kind, and with that kindling intuition that sometimes saves us whole, he was anxious to help Eugene in some way and so gain his favor. "I have something I'd like to tell you, Mr. Witla," he observed. "Well, what is it?" smiled Eugene. "Are you going out to lunch?" "Certainly. Come along." They went out together, and Morgenbau communicated to Eugene what he had heard, that the Summerfield Company had just dismissed or parted company with or lost a very capable director by the name of Freeman, and they were looking for a new man. "Why don't you apply for that?" asked Morgenbau. "You could hold it. You're doing just that sort of work that would make great ads. You know how to handle men, too. They like you. All the young fellows around here do. Why don't you go and see Mr. Summerfield? He's up in 34th Street. You might be just the man he's looking for, and then you'd have a department of your own." Eugene looked at this boy, wondering what had put this idea in his head. He decided to call up Dula, and did so at once, asking him what he thought would be the best move to make. The latter did not know Summerfield, but he knew someone who did. "I'll tell you what to do, Eugene," he said. "You go and see Baker Bates of the Santina Company. That's at the corner of Broadway and 4th Street. We do a big business with the Santina Company, and they do a big business with Summerfield. I'll send a letter over to you by a boy, and you take that. Then I'll call Bates up on the phone, and if he's favorable he can speak to Summerfield. He'll want to see you, though." Eugene was very grateful and eagerly awaited the arrival of the letter. He asked Benedict for a little time off and went to Mr. Baker Bates. The latter had heard enough from Dula to be friendly. He had been told by the latter that Eugene was potentially a great artist, slightly down on his luck, but that he was doing exceedingly well where he was and would do better in the new place. He was impressed by Eugene's appearance, for the latter had changed his style from the semi-artistic to the practical. He thought Eugene looked capable. He was certainly pleasant. "I'll talk to Mr. Summerfield for you," he said, "though I won't put much hope in what will come of it if I were you. He's a difficult man, and it's best not to appear too eager in this matter. If he can be induced to send for you, it will be much better. You let this rest until tomorrow. I'll call him up on another matter and take him out to lunch, and then I'll see how he stands, and who he has in mind, if he has anyone. He may have, you know. If there is a real opening, I'll speak of you. We'll see." Eugene went away once more very grateful. He was thinking that Dula had always meant good luck to him. He had taken his first important drawing. The pictures he had published for him had brought him favor with M. Charles. Dula had secured him the position that he had now. Would he be the cause of his getting this new one? On the way downtown on the car he encountered a cross-eyed boy. He had understood from someone recently that cross-eyed boys were good luck, cross-eyed women bad luck. A thrill of hopeful prognostication passed over him. In all likelihood he was going to get this place. If this sign came true this time, he would believe in signs. They had come true before, but this would be a real test. He stared cheerfully at the boy, and the latter looked him full in the eyes and grinned. "That settles it," said Eugene. "I'm going to get it." Still, he was far from being absolutely sure. End of section 60.